Hello, my dear friends. They didn't rot after death. They rotted while still breathing. In dark Russian neighborhoods, a drug called Krokodil turned people into something that looked alive but wasn't. Flesh peeled like paper, bones broke through skin, and the craving only grew stronger. The more they decayed, the more they injected. No one truly knows what it feels like to watch yourself dissolve from the inside. Tonight, you'll step quietly into that world and see what it means to die before dying. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background. And let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one were to wander through the grey housing blocks of post-Soviet Russia, the smell of gasoline and decay would linger stronger than bread or soap. In dim kitchens and crumbling basements, small glass bottles clinked against metal spoons, and the hiss of makeshift fires whispered of desperation. Heroin had vanished from the streets, replaced by a cheaper, crueler invention that promised the same escape for a fraction of the cost. Its name was Krokodil, a drug born not from science but from poverty and despair. It was made from codeine tablets mixed with gasoline, lighter fluid, paint thinner, and acid, substances never meant to enter a human vein. The process was simple enough to do at home, which was exactly why it spread. People who could not afford heroin made their own poison instead. The smell of the mixture was unmistakable. A sharp chemical rot that filled the walls of entire neighborhoods. Yet inside those rooms, nobody cared. The world outside already stank of hopelessness. The first users believed they had found something miraculous. It gave a rush even stronger than heroin, a burst of warmth that washed away cold, hunger, and memory. The body trembled, eyes rolled back, and for a few minutes, the world seemed distant and forgiving, but unlike heroin, this high vanished almost instantly, leaving behind a craving so fierce it demanded another dose within hours. It is darkly funny how the same hands that built engines for tractors and trucks were now using gasoline to rebuild their own veins. Every new batch was slightly different, depending on what ingredients were available, but all shared one thing: contamination. The metal and acid from crude home chemistry didn't just burn the blood, it ate it. Within days, users saw their skin turn greenish and scaly. That was how it got its name: Krokodil, the crocodile drug. The body tried to heal, but the poison kept flowing. In the streets, people whispered about neighbors whose arms peeled open like bark. The hospital stopped admitting them after realizing that treatment barely mattered. Flesh dissolved faster than doctors could clean it. Still, addicts returned to their kitchens, boiling their next dose with trembling hands. Some thought they could outsmart the drug by injecting it in new spots, but the infection always found a way. For every story of a survivor, there were dozens of others left to rot in silence. Families learned to recognize the smell before they saw the wounds. A strange metallic sweetness filled the air when another user cooked a batch nearby. It was the scent of death disguised as comfort. Authorities pretended not to notice. The poor were invisible already, and their deaths didn't interrupt the machinery of the state. Pharmacies sold codeine without a prescription, and buyers lined up daily, exchanging pills for rubles and lies. If one were to compare it to modern times, it would be like finding entire apartment blocks turning laundry detergent into narcotics because real medicine cost too much. The horror was not hidden. It was happening in plain sight. Newspapers published stories about the new plague, but by the time headlines appeared, the victims were long gone. There were no protests, no outrage, just quiet acceptance that this was what happened to those left behind. Those who made it past the first few months no longer looked human. Their faces hollowed, teeth fell out, and their limbs stiffened like dried wood. The green patches grew darker, and the smell clung to everything they touched. People crossed the street to avoid them. Children pointed and laughed before being pulled away by frightened parents. The addicts themselves rarely spoke. They existed in a cycle of craving and decay, trapped between agony and need. There is something unbearably human in how far people will go to feel nothing at all. When one batch ran out, another was made, each time a little dirtier, each time a little deadlier. The drug didn't just destroy the body, it erased identity. What began as a substitute soon became an epidemic. Entire towns seemed to fade under its influence. Factory workers, soldiers, mothers, students. No one was beyond its reach. It was a poor man's luxury, a chemical that offered the illusion of relief in a country that had forgotten how to care. Dealers didn't hide. They didn't need to. Their customers came willingly, clutching syringes and half-empty bottles of painkillers. In those crumbling stairwells, the line between living and dying blurred until it no longer mattered. Krokodil didn't promise happiness, it promised oblivion, and that was enough. The drug was never meant to last. Each use carved away another layer of flesh, another piece of the person who took it. The nickname the drug of the poor wasn't an insult but a fact. It thrived where nothing else could, feeding on the bodies of those already broken. The more people injected, the fewer came back, yet somehow the demand only grew. Maybe it was because pain felt easier to bear when shared, or maybe because no one wanted to face the truth of what they had become. In neighbourhoods where the streets once smelled of oil and bread, now only rot remained. Krokodil was not born from greed but from neglect. It was a reflection of a society that had run out of mercy. When governments fail and hope dries up, even poison can look like salvation. To those who used it, the risk of dying meant nothing compared to the certainty of being forgotten. Every needle mark was a quiet rebellion against a world that offered no kindness. It was a cry that no one wanted to hear, echoing through the hallways of cold concrete flats where life had already ended in everything but name. The drug's birth was both a symptom and a symbol, proof that when poverty reaches deep enough, it invents its own kind of hell. The fires of those homemade labs burned long into the night, lighting windows that no one dared to approach. The smoke drifted upward, carrying the ghost of what once passed for hope. The first fires that gave life to Krokodil never went out completely. They only changed form. What began as desperation turned into an industry of ruin. And as more bodies crumbled under the weight of their own decay, something far worse was about to begin. Somewhere in that silence, the addiction started to eat not only flesh, but the mind itself. The first injection felt like being set on fire and saved at the same time. The skin flushed with sudden heat, the blood rushed, and for one fleeting moment, everything seemed merciful. The pain of hunger, the dull ache of hopelessness, the endless noise of survival all faded into a silence that felt like peace. The warmth crawled from the arm to the chest, rising to the head in waves that blurred vision and thought alike. Every pulse became a whisper of pleasure, soft and deceitful. The body trembled, not from fear but from surrender. It was a kind of calm that only those who have suffered too long could mistake for comfort. The first high of Krokodil was never gentle. It struck quickly, pulling users into a trance that blurred the edge between life and death. Many said they could feel their skin melt, yet they smiled through it. The world turned into a dull hum, like a memory already fading. What heroin did slowly, Krokodil achieved violently. The body could not process the assault, yet the brain begged for more. There is a strange cruelty in how the human mind mistakes destruction for relief. The heartbeat slowed, the eyes glazed, and time lost meaning. It was not euphoria, not truly was a curtain drawn over pain, brief enough to make people chase it endlessly. When the effect faded, the crash was immediate. The warmth drained away, leaving behind a hollow chill that settled deep in the bones. The mouth turned dry, the hands shook uncontrollably, and sweat rolled down the temples like cold rain. A voice inside whispered that another shot would bring peace again, that the agony could be postponed just a little longer. That whisper became a command. Users picked up their syringes, still sticky with residue, and pressed them against the same wounds that had not yet healed. The veins darkened, the skin burned, but the need was louder than pain. No one believed they would become addicted after a single try, but the body remembered too well. Within hours, the craving returned like hunger. It wasn't just physical, it was spiritual, like something sacred had been taken away. If this happened today, it would be like a generation inhaling corrosion straight from car engines and calling it therapy. The high promised escape, but what it gave was erasure. Sleep came only in fragments, interrupted by shivers and nausea. The pupils shrank to pinpoints. The breath reeked of chemicals. Yet even in this decay, users smiled when the next rush came, calling it beautiful, calling it love. Some people claimed that Krokodil opened doors inside the mind, that it gave them visions or dreams, but those visions were hallucinations born from suffocation. Walls seemed to breathe, shadows whispered, and light fractured into colours that didn't exist. Some felt insects under their skin, others heard laughter that wasn't there. The drug's poison reached the brain long before it devoured the flesh. Once it entered, there was no returning to what felt normal. Every injection erased a memory, a habit, or a boundary. The body's alarm bells went silent, and all that remained was repetition. It is terrifying to realize how easily pleasure turns into obedience. Even as their veins collapsed, users called the drug their only friend. It forgave everything: shame, hunger, loneliness, to take payment in blood. The high became the only time they felt alive, and that was enough to justify everything else. The hands that once held tools or pens now shook with the ritual of mixing powder with gasoline. The hiss of flame against metal became the sound of comfort. Around them, life shrank to the size of a needle. Meals, families, and sleep no longer mattered. The injection was the clock, the heartbeat, the faith. When the poison finally began to eat through their muscles, most ignored it. The green sores were easy to hide under sleeves. It was the withdrawal that frightened them more than the rot. When the drug left their blood, every nerve screamed. Skin crawled, teeth ached, bones twisted inside the body as though trying to escape. The only way to silence it was to return to the same syringe, the same poison. There was no interval long enough for healing, no space for reflection. The body stopped waiting for recovery and began waiting only for relief. Over time, the highs grew shorter, the crashes longer. The body became a battlefield between craving and collapse. People no longer recognized themselves in the mirror. Faces hollowed, lips cracked, and eyes lost color. The brain still chased the first rush, though it had long become unreachable. That first feeling of warmth remained the ghost they were all trying to summon again, knowing it would never come. Yet the memory of that warmth, illusion of peace, was the strongest chain of all. Addiction was not a choice anymore. It was a rhythm. The moments between doses felt like drowning, and each new injection was another gasp of air. But every breath carried more poison, and every gasp brought them closer to suffocation. It was not the death they feared. It was the silence without the drug. In that silence, they had to remember who they were before, and that was unbearable. The first taste of Krokodil was both salvation and sentence. The warmth that once felt like mercy would soon turn into infection, and in that feverish glow, the line between pleasure and decay would vanish completely. They called it Krokodil because the skin changed first. Around the injection marks, a faint green tint appeared, subtle at the beginning, like a bruise that refused to fade. Then the texture changed. Small cracks formed, the surface hardened, and the skin began to flake. It was not just rot, It was transformation. The poison in the blood found its way to the flesh, and what had once been human started to look reptilian. In basements and alleyways, arms and legs gleamed with the dull shine of scales. The body no longer belonged to the person inside. It had become a map of decay, traced line by line with every injection. The drug's ingredients, crude and corrosive, burned from the inside out. The mixture of gasoline, paint thinner, and acid destroyed blood vessels, starving tissues of oxygen until they blackened. The wounds festered quickly, softening the edges of skin until they peeled away entirely. At first, users wrapped rags around their arms to hide the damage. But soon, the infection spread so fast that no fabric could contain it. Flesh softened and cracked, leaking fluids that smelled metallic and sickly sweet. The scent of rot became their constant shadow. There is something morbidly poetic about a drug that eats its victims slowly enough to let them watch. Doctors compared the lesions to gangrene, but even that word seemed too mild. Some patients arrived with bones exposed, and the muscle dissolved completely. Others tried to amputate their own limbs when the pain became unbearable. Yet despite the horror, many continued to inject. The fear of withdrawal outweighed the certainty of mutilation. It was as if the body itself had become irrelevant, a disposable shell. The only thing that mattered was feeding the addiction. Hospitals turned them away, unable to help or unwilling to try. Nurses whispered that treating krokodil addicts was like trying to stitch together corpses. At its peak, entire wards in Russian cities were filled with the same sight: people wrapped in bandages, their skin green, their eyes distant. They looked like something out of a nightmare, but the nightmare was real. Infected wounds oozed beneath gauze, and the smell of gasoline lingered even after cleaning. The body, stripped of its ability to heal, decayed while still alive. The nickname Krokodil was not cruel irony. It was accurate. Each user carried the evidence of their addiction on their skin, a mark that warned others yet tempted them all the same. People who saw them on the streets rarely spoke. Children stared before being pulled away by their parents. Those still able to walk covered themselves with long sleeves, though everyone knew what hid beneath. If this existed today, it would be like seeing crowds of people with their skin dissolving in real time while society scrolls past their photos online. The fascination with horror was stronger than compassion. In towns where the drug spread fastest, people began to talk about the crocodiles, as if the addicts were no longer human. That language made it easier to look away. The transformation was not only physical. The skin might rot, but something deeper died first. The sense of shame disappeared. The addicts spoke less, cared less, felt less. They were beyond embarrassment, beyond pity. The body was an obstacle to be endured, not protected. Some even found dark humour in it, calling their wounds badges of strength. They joked about shedding their skin like snakes, though everyone knew what came next. Death did not frighten them. It was simply another stage of the process. It's haunting to realise how quickly horror becomes routine when survival feels pointless. In the places where crocodiles spread most, industrial towns and mining villages, death was not new. Accidents, disease, and poverty had already worn down the population. The drug only made the invisible visible. The grotesque bodies of the users mirrored the decay of the cities themselves. Rusting factories, crumbling apartments, broken people, it all blended into one slow collapse. No one expected a rescue. No one came. The addicts crawled through life half alive, their skin peeling, their minds fading. Even as bones emerged through the flesh, they still searched for their next fix. The pain was unimaginable, yet the addiction was stronger. Many described the sensation of insects crawling under their skin, of heat and pressure that could not be relieved. Scratching made it worse, tearing the thin layers until the wounds deepened. Some tried to burn the infection out with cigarettes or heated spoons. Others cut at their arms in panic, convinced that removing the skin might save what was left underneath. Nothing worked. The poison had already become part of them, coursing through every vein. There was no boundary left between drug and body. Authorities spoke about the crisis in clinical terms: epidemic, infection, public health concern. But behind those words were lives that had turned into carcasses before death. Photographs emerged, and the world gasped briefly before turning the page. The addicts became a symbol of moral decay, an easy story for those who wanted to feel superior. But within the neighbourhoods where it all began, no one needed headlines. The evidence was in the smell, in the green stains on the walls, in the quiet thud of another body collapsing. Some users tried to hide in isolation, ashamed of what they had become. They sealed themselves inside their apartments, covering mirrors, throwing blankets over the windows. But isolation only deepened the spiral. The skin healed more slowly, infections grew, and hallucinations returned. Without light, time vanished. They lost count of days, then of doses. When someone finally broke down the door, the body inside no longer looked human. It was grey, cracked, and rigid, like the shell of some ancient creature unearthed from filth. Krokodil's reputation spread faster than any warning could contain it. People whispered about it as a curse, a punishment for poverty, or a myth to frighten others. Yet the addicts themselves were proof that it was all real. They were walking reminders of how hunger and despair could turn flesh against itself. The name Krokodil carried both fear and recognition. Everyone understood it meant death, but death had lost its meaning long ago. In the eyes of the users, the transformation was already complete. They were monsters now, and monsters could not be saved. What began as a chemical reaction had become a kind of identity. They were no longer people using a drug. They were the drug, embodied, alive, and rotting. Their green skin glistened under flickering lights, their bones stretching against paper-thin flesh. Every breath came with a rattle, every step left a stain. The metamorphosis was total. The line between life and decomposition blurred beyond return. The name Krokodil was never just a description, it was a prophecy. The flesh had turned to scales, the people had turned to ghosts, and what remained was neither human nor dead. The body had become the message, and the message was rot. Somewhere beyond that decay, the mind would soon begin to crumble too. Krokodil did not kill instantly. It was patient, deliberate, and almost intimate in the way it destroyed. The first wounds were small, nothing more than tender bruises or darkened patches of skin that could be hidden beneath clothing, but with every injection, the poison carved deeper, stripping flesh from the bone as if it had been waiting all along. The body did not die at once. It lingered, caught between survival and decay, a breathing corpse that refused to stop. Those who used it learned quickly that death was not the punishment. Living through the process was... Each dose felt like a negotiation with pain. The drug soothed it for a moment, only to make it return tenfold. The craving was stronger than logic, stronger than fear. Even as blood mixed with pus under the skin, even as pieces of flesh came loose from the arm, the need whispered again. The body shook, the heart fluttered, but the hands did not hesitate. The syringe slid into the same wound, reopening what had barely scabbed over. The pain was no longer a warning, it was a companion. There is something absurdly human about finding comfort in the thing that kills you. The addicts were aware of what was happening to them. They saw their bodies fall apart in mirrors and still prepared the next injection. Some tried to delay, telling themselves they would stop after one more dose, but when the sickness came, the shaking, the nausea, the crawling under the skin, they caved every time. The pain of withdrawal stripped away reason, the brain screamed for relief, and the body obeyed. Families begged, doctors refused, and in the quiet of their rooms, the addicts chose poison over survival. It was not bravery or defiance. It was a surrender disguised as need. The drug worked like a slow infection of identity. At first, the skin went, then the muscle, then the mind. Nerves dulled, senses warped, and the concept of self disintegrated. The addict became a series of habits, a body operating on instinct alone. When they looked down at their hands, they saw the outlines of bone beneath rotting flesh. The smell of gasoline clung to their pores, seeping from within. Yet even in that stench of decomposition, there was hunger. The need for the next dose was stronger than disgust. If this were happening today, it would be like people live streaming their own decay and calling it endurance. The neighbours heard them sometimes, groans that didn't sound human, thuds from behind closed doors, the hiss of flames as another batch was cooked. No one called for help. Everyone knew the sound of addiction too well. Ambulances rarely came anymore. When one did, the medics entered wearing gloves and masks, leaving the windows open to chase away the stench. They spoke in short sentences, doing their jobs without looking too closely. The bodies they handled were not yet dead, but no one believed they would recover. The addicts themselves began to change their perception of pain. What once felt unbearable became routine. Open wounds were cleaned with vodka, wrapped in shirts, and ignored. The brain adjusted to agony the way it adjusted to hunger, by forgetting. They learned to inject around the scars, to find new veins when the old ones collapsed. Some went for the legs, the feet, even the neck. It was a brutal map of survival carved onto the skin. The drug didn't just eat the body, it taught it how to decay more efficiently. The lesson was cruel but consistent. There was always another way to rot. In hospital reports, the doctors wrote about progressive necrosis and rapid tissue loss. But the reality was far worse than those words could hold. The skin split like wet paper, the bones turned brittle, and the smell of infection lingered in hallways long after patients were gone. It is horrifying how easily the human body adapts to dying when it has no other choice. For those who survived more than a few months, death became a distant rumour. They were already living it. Every breath came with pain, yet every moment without the drug felt worse. The addicts entered a state where suffering became familiar, almost comforting. To stop meant to face clarity, and clarity was unbearable. The memories of what they once were, mothers, workers, friends, burned too brightly against the darkness of addiction. The drug softened that light, and they craved that numbness more than relief. Even when their arms fell open to the bone, they continued to inject. The act itself became mechanical, almost religious. It no longer mattered that the veins were gone. They found new places, pushing needles into muscle or fat, anything that would take the fluid. The skin bubbled and burst, but the high returned for a few minutes, enough to silence the screams. Their bodies were laboratories of decay, experiments in endurance and surrender. Witnesses said the sight of these users haunted them for years. The smell clung to memory like smoke, and the sound of shallow breathing echoed long after. Some addicts died mid-injection, the needle still hanging from their arm. Others lived for months without recognizable flesh. They didn't speak. They didn't scream. They simply waited for the next moment of warmth, the final imitation of pleasure. What Krokodil did best was blur the line between living and decomposing. It stripped away everything unnecessary, fear, shame, even identity, and left behind something that only wanted to continue existing for another dose. The human form was no longer sacred, it was fuel. And in those final days, each addict learned that the body could be emptied long before death came. Krokodil did not strike in one blow, it devoured slowly, piece by piece. The flesh peeled, the mind hollowed, and still the craving remained. Somewhere inside that agony, the addiction began to whisper that this was not the end but the beginning of something far more monstrous. Addiction came quietly at first, disguised as relief. A few injections were enough to set the pattern, simple and absolute. The body, once hesitant, began to anticipate the drug before it was even mixed. The skin tingled, the mouth watered, and the veins seemed to ache in advance, as if begging for the sting of the needle. The craving grew faster than understanding. Within days, the line between need and want vanished. The user was no longer chasing a high, they were chasing the absence of pain. The drug rewrote every instinct, making survival dependent on poison. The brain adapted with ruthless precision. Every drop of Krokodil trained it to forget restraint, to remember only reward. Nerve pathways that once responded to pleasure now responded only to the chemical. Sleep, food, touch, sound, none of it mattered. The only thing that brought comfort was the hiss of the flame, the swirl of powder in a spoon, the brief rush of heat that followed the injection. There is a dark kind of logic in how addiction replaces desire with ritual. The hands learned the motions by heart, trembling but efficient. It no longer mattered if the mixture burned through veins or brought hallucinations. What mattered was that it silenced the emptiness for a moment. Krokodil addiction did not wait for months or years to take hold. It claimed its victims in weeks. The body could not escape it, and neither could the mind. Those who stopped even for a day found themselves in a state beyond agony. The body convulsed, drenched in sweat. The stomach turned against itself, and the bones felt as if they were being crushed from within. The craving returned like fire under the skin, impossible to extinguish. Many described it as dying in slow motion, except that the only cure for the dying was another dose. The cycle had no mercy and no exit. It became routine. Wake up, inject, fade, collapse, inject again. The drug created its own sense of time. Days and nights blurred together in a rhythm of sickness and relief. Meals disappeared, conversations stopped. Families watched as their loved ones turned into ghosts, alive only in the moments between injections. The rest of the time was waiting. Waiting for money, for the next supply, for the next temporary silence. If this existed today, it would be like people willingly locking themselves in burning rooms, believing the fire was keeping them warm. Every addict convinced themselves they had control. They promised to stop after one more dose, one more day, one more week. But Krokodil didn't allow bargains. The chemical held its grip like iron. It punished delay with pain so fierce that it erased all thought. Even those who tried to quit often returned after a few hours, their resolve melting into desperation. The brain's reward system had been hijacked completely. It no longer sought pleasure, it sought escape from withdrawal. What had started as curiosity became compulsion, and compulsion turned into survival. The world around them shrank. Friends vanished. Jobs ended. Homes turned to ruins of clutter and filth. The only relationships left were with other users, bound not by affection, but by dependence. They shared doses, traded ingredients, and watched each other decay in silence. Theirs was a community without hope, where every act of kindness was measured in drops of poison. They laughed sometimes, hollow and fleeting, at the absurdity of it all. There is something unbearably tragic about how people bond most deeply over their own destruction. Withdrawal became the only fear greater than death. When the drug began to fade, their bodies rebelled violently. Muscles clenched, teeth ground against each other, and visions twisted reality into nightmares. Some begged to be restrained. Others begged for one more injection. None of them could endure the storm for long. Their tolerance rose with every dose, and soon the same amount that once numbed them barely touched the pain. They increased it, over and over, until their veins gave out, forcing them to find new places to inject. The process was endless, mechanical, and merciless. In this cycle, time lost meaning. Days passed without memory, and weeks dissolved into the same grey sequence of cravings and collapse. No one planned for the future anymore. The next hour was all that mattered. When the body demanded, the mind obeyed. The addicts became predictable in their desperation, selling clothes, stealing scraps, begging, anything to feed the cycle. The drug didn't just consume them, it consumed everything around them, turning homes into empty shells, relationships into silence, and lives into waiting rooms for death. For those who tried to stop, the punishment was worse than the habit. Detox centres refused them, unable to manage the severe physical breakdowns. The organs failed, the skin split open, and infection spread faster than any treatment could handle. Every attempt at recovery ended in relapse or death. The few who managed to survive without using again were left crippled by pain and memory, haunted by the ghost of the craving that never left completely. The cruelest truth was that most addicts knew exactly what was happening. They understood that each injection brought them closer to the end, but the drug had stripped away their fear of consequences. It offered an illusion of choice where none existed. Each time the needle touched skin, they felt both relief and resignation. Krokodil did not need to persuade, it simply waited for the body to surrender, and it always did. Addiction was not a sudden fall, but a circle without exit. The drug demanded, the body obeyed, and the mind forgot. In that endless repetition, suffering became a habit, and hope became a memory. Somewhere within that silence, the craving began to grow hungry for more than just the flesh. It started to devour the soul itself. The kitchen was never meant for this. The same space that once held bread and tea became a laboratory of desperation. The table was covered with empty blister packs of codeine pills, bottles of lighter fluid, paint thinner, and rusted spoons blackened by fire. A few scraps of aluminum foil, a syringe half filled with something cloudy, and a glass jar used for mixing. These were the tools of the new alchemists. Krokodil was never sold in fancy bags or wrapped in secrecy. It was made in homes, by hands that trembled from craving, in rooms too small to breathe. There was no precision, no cleanliness, no measure beyond guesswork. Each batch was a gamble between life, death, and something in between. The process was simple enough to learn but impossible to master. Codeine tablets were crushed into powder, mixed with gasoline, acid, and solvents meant to clean metal or strip paint. The smell was chemical and sharp, burning the nostrils, coating everything it touched with a film of poison. The mixture hissed and bubbled over open flames, sending fumes through the air that left users coughing before they even injected. But none of it mattered. What mattered was the moment the liquid turned pale green, the colour they believed meant success, the same colour their skin would later become. There is a terrible irony in how they cooked their own destruction as if preparing dinner. Without any standard or safety, every batch was unique. Some came out weak and did nothing. Others burned through the bloodstream in seconds. A single mistake, a spark too strong, a measurement too careless, could cause explosions. Many users suffered burns long before the drug ever entered their veins. Fire scars ran across their arms and faces, melted skin fused with chemical residue. Yet even with blistered hands, they returned to their stoves the next day. Addiction made every danger seem like an inconvenience. Pain became part of the recipe. The rooms where they cooked were tombs of residue. The air felt heavy, soaked in the stench of gasoline and spoiled flesh. Curtains turned black with soot, and windows stayed closed to keep neighbours from smelling the fumes. The addicts worked in silence, moving with slow precision, as if performing a sacred ritual. Their eyes were glazed but focused, hands steady despite the shaking that had plagued them moments before. When the mixture began to thicken, they smiled faintly, believing they were close to relief. It was not creation they were performing, it was decay turned into routine. The ingredients came easily. Pharmacies sold codeine over the counter. Hardware stores offered acid and solvent without question. Paint thinner, iodine, phosphorus scraped from match heads. All of it was within reach. Poverty made access effortless. No one needed laboratories or dealers. Every addict could become their own supplier. If this happened in our time, it would be like entire neighbourhoods turning their kitchens into chemical factories just to forget hunger for a few hours. The state rarely intervened. The deaths were too frequent, the faces too familiar. Society learned to treat them as background noise, like traffic or rain. Explosions were common. Walls were scorched, ceilings collapsed, and the smell of burning plastic filled the air. Some addicts died instantly when a jar cracked or when vapours caught fire. Others survived but carried burns so deep that skin grafts were useless. Hospitals refused them, knowing that beneath the injuries lay addiction too advanced to treat. Those who lived continued to cook, using the same ruined hands that could no longer close properly. It was not courage but compulsion that kept them alive. They were trapped inside a loop of chemical creation and self-destruction. The risk of infection was constant. Dirty needles, unfiltered liquids, and contaminated tools ensured that every dose carried disease, hepatitis, HIV, gangrene, names that meant nothing to people already half dead. When they could no longer find veins, they injected into muscles or open wounds. The flesh swelled, turned purple, then split. Even then, they wiped it with alcohol, grimacing, and injected again. The idea of survival was no longer tied to health. Survival meant continuing the ritual. They had built an entire existence around pain, repetition, and a few minutes of numbness. Inside these kitchens, the line between scientist and corpse blurred. Every ingredient was poison, yet they handled it with care. They whispered numbers, stirred mixtures, watched for the right colour, the right smell. A small victory came when the liquid settled and stopped bubbling. They drew it into syringes like lifeblood, ignoring the debris floating inside. The liquid burned on contact, but by then, their veins were already scarred beyond feeling. The smell lingered long after the act, clinging to clothes, hair, and skin. No amount of washing could erase it. The most chilling part was the quiet. No one screamed. No one panicked. No one stopped. The addicts had learned to move through disaster as though it were routine. Flames flared, glass cracked, blood dripped onto the floor, all of it absorbed into the rhythm of their making. In the silence after each batch, they sat and stared, eyes empty but alert, waiting for the next moment of heat. They were alive, but only technically. Authorities called it DIY chemistry, as if the phrase made it less horrific. But this was not an invention. It was decay mechanized, despair refined. The addicts were not inventors. They were participants in their own slow erasure. Every new batch meant another piece of them gone forever. The drug didn't just claim bodies, it claimed spaces, transforming kitchens, basements, and garages into shrines of rot. Families abandoned homes that smelled too much like gasoline and grief. The cities carried the scent like a confession no one wanted to make. The making of Krokodil was never about creation. It was about survival inside destruction. The addicts built their own death with precision, burned their hands to feel alive, and named the smoke their salvation. Somewhere inside those collapsing rooms, the next batch was already bubbling, a promise of relief that would taste like metal and end like fire. The body always gives warning before it collapses, but with Krokodil, those warnings became daily scenery. Around each injection site, small sores began to bloom, red at first, then black at the edges. The skin grew tight and glossy, pulsing faintly as if trying to hold everything inside. Within days, the wound opened like fruit left too long in the sun. The infection crawled underneath the surface, following veins like rivers until the flesh above them began to die. The smell arrived next, thick, metallic, and unmistakable. It lingered on the fingertips, in the fabric of clothes, in the hair of anyone who got too close. Those who lived in the same buildings grew used to it, the way people get used to train noise or smoke. The scent of decay became part of the neighbourhood air. The body tried to repair itself, but the poison was faster. Every new injection reawakened the wound, pushing bacteria deeper, flooding tissue with chemicals that had no place in blood. When the rot reached the muscle, the skin peeled away easily. It did not bleed much. The vessels were already destroyed. The muscle beneath turned grey, soft and wet. It clung to the bone for a while before sliding away in strips. The addicts wrapped their arms in rags, believing they could hide it, but the stench betrayed them. Neighbours spoke of the walking dead, not as an insult but as a description. There is a grim efficiency in how the body decays when the soul has already surrendered. Some tried to wash the wounds with vodka or bleach. Others smeared toothpaste, petroleum jelly, or ashes over the holes. Nothing helped. The infections had gone too deep. Flies gathered in the folds of bandages, and maggots appeared, feeding on what remained. Hospitals refused to take them in. The doctors said there was nothing to save. Limbs were amputated, sometimes without anaesthesia, but even that rarely worked. The infection moved faster than surgery. Many died within weeks, but others lingered, fleshless and still breathing. The human body has a cruel habit of surviving just long enough to feel everything. The sight was unforgettable. Hands that once built machines or held children now resemble the skeletons drawn in anatomy books. Fingers lost shape as tendons snapped and skin shriveled into brown parchment. In some cases, bones pushed through, sharp and clean, framed by rotting tissue. The addicts could see their own structures, the architecture beneath their skin. Some stared in fascination, others ignored it entirely. Their minds had learned to detach, to see the disintegration as something happening to someone else. The mirror showed bones, but they no longer recognized them as their own. The rot didn't stay still, it spread inward, following the bloodstream, turning soft tissue into sludge. The feet went next, then the legs, then the face. The nose collapsed, the lips thinned, and the eyes sank into dark hollows. The disease gave them a reptilian appearance that made the name crocodile feel prophetic. Skin lost colour, taking on the same pale green as the drug itself. A cruel symmetry. What they created now created them. If this happened today, the images would flood the internet shared with disgust and fascination. Another tragedy turned into spectacle. But during the years when Krokodil ruled the poor districts of Russia, there were no cameras, only the silence of witnesses who stopped looking. In some apartments, entire families lived together. The smell of death came from behind closed doors, seeping through cracks in the wall. Children learned early to recognize it and avoid those rooms. When someone died, the others dragged the body outside or burned it in secret to avoid questions. Police stopped entering those neighborhoods altogether. The sound of coughing, the hiss of fire under spoons, and the thud of collapsing bodies became normal background noise. It was not hidden horror. It was accepted routine. The addicts themselves rarely screamed. Pain had become constant, too familiar for reaction. They spoke little, sometimes muttering half-finished sentences before fading into silence. When they could no longer walk, others carried them to the places where drugs were shared, laying them on dirty mattresses or directly on the floor. The only kindness left was injection, giving another person their dose when their hands could no longer hold the syringe. Compassion and destruction merged until they were indistinguishable. It is unbearable to think that tenderness could exist in the act of helping someone inject poison into their own veins. Those who cleaned the streets or worked in morgues described the bodies as melting. They did not stiffen after death. They collapsed into themselves, the flesh sliding away from the bone in soft sheets. The clothes fused to the skin, the smell of gasoline and rot thick enough to make people gag. It took multiple layers of wrapping to contain it. Sometimes, when they lifted the corpses, the limbs came off in their hands. No one spoke while they worked. There were too many, and the faces were all the same, half rotted, half young. The worst part was not the sight or the smell, but the sound. The addicts made noises that were neither cries nor words, just low moans that came from somewhere deep in the chest. They were not calling for help. They were waiting. The body still fought for breath even when there was nothing left to preserve. Each inhale sounded wet, each exhale shallow and final, but they didn't stop. Between breaths, someone always reached for a syringe. The brain still believed in the next rush, even as the body was falling apart. Occasionally, reporters came to document what was left of these places. They wrote about the green flesh, the bones, the smell, the poverty. For a week, the headlines carried words like flesh-eating drug and zombie addicts. Then the world moved on. The addicts did not. They stayed in their kitchens, in their rooms, under bridges, still mixing, still injecting. The cycle of rot continued without interruption. The decay was not an accident. It was the rhythm of their existence. In some ways, the physical horror of Krokodil was easier to face than the silence behind it. Society could handle wounds, but not the reasons those wounds existed. Poverty, neglect, despair. Those did not make good headlines. So the world looked at the bones, shuddered, and then forgot. But the addicts didn't have the luxury of forgetting. Their own bodies were reminders that never faded. Each breath carried the smell of their own decomposition. Each movement tore something loose inside. Yet, somehow, they remained alive long enough to witness it all. The sight of flesh melting and bones showing was not just the body dying, it was the soul unraveling. The addicts watched themselves rot in real time, unable to stop, unwilling to care. And somewhere within that grotesque quiet, the smell of death began to feel like home. Death did not come gently to those who used Krokodil. It arrived piece by piece, dragging its feet through the halls, leaving the sound of dripping and breathing behind. The addicts rarely died quickly. They endured, half-conscious, waiting for the end that never seemed to arrive. Their bodies had long since begun to rot, but the heart kept beating, the lungs kept trembling. They were alive in the most cruel and technical sense, sustained by habit rather than hope. The pain was constant, a noise that never stopped, like machinery running deep inside a dying body. The infection gnawed through limbs, and when the flesh finally loosened, parts of the body fell away with soft, wet sounds. Fingers slid from hands, toes detached from feet. The addicts often didn't notice until later, when movement became impossible. The human body, even when dying, can be shockingly resilient. It fights to stay alive even while falling apart. For Krokodil users, that resilience became a curse. They lived long enough to feel every stage of decay. Neighbours heard the sounds, low groans, gasps, the thud of something heavy hitting the floor, and pretended not to know where it came from. The smell reached through the walls long before anyone dared to open the door. It was the odour of infection and gasoline, thick enough to stick in the throat. Flies gathered around the door frames, and still the addicts breathed inside, too weak to move, too stubborn to die. There is something almost mocking about a death so slow it forces you to listen to yourself rot. Many addicts whispered about death as a release. They spoke of it with reverence, like a door they were too tired to knock on. For them, the end was not tragic, it was mercy. But the body refused to cooperate. The heart kept beating in defiance of every wish. When the pain grew unbearable, they injected again, not to live, but to dull the edge of dying. Krokodil turned agony into ritual, turning every injection into a prayer for silence. If this existed now, it would be like watching people trapped in burning rooms, unable to escape, yet singing to the flames that are consuming them. The neighbours who remained learned to ignore the sounds. They stopped visiting, stopped knocking, stopped asking questions. The addicts became phantoms behind closed doors, shadows no one wanted to face. Some apartments were sealed off entirely, the stench too thick for even the bravest to approach. When authorities finally came, they found the rooms layered in ash and filth. The air shimmered with rot. On tables sat half-empty syringes, jars of acid, and cups filled with stagnant water. The curtains stayed drawn, the mirrors cracked. Every surface told the same story, a battle already lost. Those who still clung to life often lay on the floor, unmoving, watching the light from the window fade. Their voices grew faint, their movements slow, their eyes dull and unfocused. Pain no longer frightened them. What frightened them was the return of consciousness between injections, those long, unbearable minutes when clarity returned and they saw the state of their bodies. Some wept quietly, others laughed, a dry, broken sound that echoed through the empty rooms. It was laughter without joy, an instinct born from disbelief. No one touched them anymore. Even the living were treated like the dead. Family members, if they existed, left food outside the door and disappeared. The addicts existed in complete isolation, surrounded only by the sounds of their own decay. Every cough, every movement, every drop of blood that hit the floor became part of a dreadful symphony that no one wanted to hear. The body was decomposing while the mind watched, aware but powerless. It is horrifying how much noise a dying body can make when no one is listening. Those who died alone were often discovered days later, sometimes weeks later. The process of decomposition continued without pause. The rooms turned warm and wet, the air unbearable. When the doors were opened, the scene was always the same, a mattress stained black. A body collapsed into itself, bones showing through what remained of skin. The smell filled the building, driving neighbours away for days. Yet the addicts were never remembered by name. They became stories, whispers, warnings, nothing more. The city cleaned up the mess, replaced the locks, and life went on as if nothing had happened. A few addicts lived long enough to witness others die. They watched friends decay beside them, too weak to move the bodies, too numb to care. When someone stopped breathing, there was no panic. The others simply sat in silence, waiting for the same. Death had become routine, stripped of meaning. They no longer feared it because they were already living inside it. The sound of one more body collapsing was just another reminder of what was coming. In hospitals, the ones who managed to crawl for help rarely made it far. Their skin was split open, muscles liquefied, eyes sunken deep. Nurses stood at a distance, covering their faces, unable to bear the smell. Doctors took notes without touching the patients, documenting a kind of suffering that had no cure. The addicts were still alive, but medicine could not reach them anymore. Painkillers did nothing. Sedatives barely dulled the edges. The body had gone beyond repair, and the mind was no longer part of the equation. At some point, the body simply stopped resisting. The heart slowed, the breathing faded, and the pain dissolved into nothing. The addicts did not fight it. They welcomed it like sleep after endless exhaustion. When death finally came, it was quiet. No screams, no struggle, just stillness. For a brief moment, peace returned to the room. The flies scattered, the air calmed, and the smell of gasoline mixed with something almost sweet. Then the silence became absolute. Krokodil never gave its victims mercy. It forced them to linger, to hear the sound of their own bodies falling apart, to wait for a death that arrived too late. The neighbours turned away, the city moved on, and only the silence remained heavy in the air. Somewhere, another room filled with the same smell, another heartbeat slowed, another voice whispered to the darkness, begging for the end to finally come. The destruction always started on the outside but eventually made its way inward. After the skin had peeled and the bones had shown, the rest of the body began to follow. The gums receded until teeth hung loose in blackened sockets, shifting with every breath. The mouth filled with the taste of iron and gasoline, the tongue raw from constant dryness. Food lost its flavour, then its meaning. The addicts stopped eating altogether, unable to chew or swallow without pain. Soon. The teeth fell out one by one, clinking softly onto the floor or sticking to bloodied lips. Smiles disappeared, replaced by empty gaps that looked more like wounds than expressions. The mouth became a hollow entrance to a body collapsing from within. The eyes followed next. At first, they were bloodshot, the white stained yellow from toxins. Over time, they turned cloudy, a milky haze spreading across the pupils until sight was nothing more than light and shadow. Some lost vision in one eye before the other, walking in circles, hands outstretched against the walls. The world blurred into outlines, then into nothing. It was not blindness in the poetic sense, but literal darkness, the body's way of shutting out what had become unbearable to see. There is a cruel justice in how Krokodil blinds its users only after showing them everything. Inside, the organs struggled to survive in the chemical storm. The kidneys, forced to filter the poison, shriveled from exhaustion. The liver hardened. Veins in the abdomen bulged like cords beneath the skin, and the heart beat irregularly, as though confused by what was still left to pump. Breathing grew shallow. Every exhale rattled with phlegm and blood. The abdomen swelled with trapped fluid, pressing against ribs that had long stopped expanding properly. In the end, every system that once sustained life became part of the decay. The body was not dying in one place, it was decomposing everywhere at once. The addicts barely noticed. The deterioration came slowly enough that it felt normal. They adapted to sickness as easily as they had adapted to pain. When vomiting became routine, they learned to keep buckets beside the bed. When urine turned brown or red, they ignored it. When the chest hurt, they blamed the cold, not the failing heart. The body's warning signs lost all meaning. If this were happening now, it would be like watching people rot in live broadcast while comment sections debate whose fault it is. The horror would still be there, but it would come with distraction, with distance. In the streets where it happened, there was no distance, only the smell of failing bodies, the sound of coughing, and the quiet repetition of another injection. Their voices changed, too. The throat burned from fumes and infection, leaving only hoarse whispers. Some sounded as if they were growling when they spoke, their vocal cords eroded by smoke and chemicals. Even breathing was loud, a rasping noise that echoed down the hallways of old apartments. They no longer called out for help. They called out for the drug, the only thing that still answered. The sound was not a plea. It was instinct. The body, even when destroyed, continued to beg for what was killing it. On rare occasions, one of them would end up in a hospital. Doctors took notes, nurses covered their noses, and journalists wrote articles about the human cost of addiction. Machines beeped around the beds, but the patients lay still, eyes glassy, chests rising in slow, uneven rhythms. There was no cure, no medicine that could repair a system so poisoned. Each heartbeat was a countdown, each breath a final performance. The organs shut down in sequence, the kidneys first, then the liver, then the heart. The machines kept track of it all, translating death into numbers on a screen. Some addicts lived long enough to sense their own organs giving out. The feeling was not sharp, just a deep heaviness, as if the inside of the body were turning to stone. They could feel their pulse weaken, their skin grow cold, their thoughts slow down. Some said it was peaceful, but peace had no meaning for them anymore. It was simply the absence of noise, of pain, of needing. The drug had eaten everything else, leaving behind a strange stillness. It was not relief, it was emptiness. The decay of the senses changed the way they moved. Without teeth, food lost purpose. Without sight, direction vanished. Without strength, breathing became a task. They crawled through rooms on hands and knees, knocking over bottles and syringes. Sometimes they fell asleep mid-movement, collapsing like puppets with broken strings. When they woke, they were injected again. The rhythm never broke. It didn't matter if their hearts skipped beats, if their lungs filled with fluid. The addiction had long replaced survival. People who had once known them could no longer recognize what was left. The faces were hollow, skin grey, eyes milky and empty. Words slurred together, voices cracked. They resembled the dead more than the living, and yet they kept breathing. Death came in stages, small and methodical. The heart did not stop suddenly. It slowed, hesitated, then continued, almost reluctantly. The body clung to life like a habit it could not quit. In the final days, every organ betrayed them. The blood turned thick and sluggish. Clots formed in the veins, and the brain flickered between consciousness and delirium. Hallucinations returned. Faces from memory. Lights that were not there. Voices whispering promises of warmth. Some thought they saw rivers, or animals, or people calling their names. It was not the drug anymore, but the brain misfiring as it drowned in its own poison. In those last moments, the body became a collection of memories collapsing under chemical weight. There was no dignity in it, no quiet redemption. The body that once belonged to a person became an exhibit of ruin. Hospitals and morgues catalogued the damage in photographs, teeth gone, eyes cloudy, organs blackened and shriveled. The reports were cold, clinical, and efficient. They reduced the life of a person to a series of notes: necrosis, renal failure, blindness, and cardiac arrest. Yet behind those words was the story of someone who once laughed, once worked, once loved, before the drug replaced everything. Krokodil did not just claim the body, it devoured the senses, the organs, and the will to care. The teeth fell, the eyes dimmed, the organs folded under the weight of poison, and somewhere within that slow collapse, the body kept breathing, long enough to prove that even death took pity on no one. Hospitals were not places of hope for krokodil addicts. They were the end of the line, a hallway where doctors whispered and turned their faces away. The moment a patient arrived with rotting flesh and the unmistakable smell of gasoline, the decision was already made. Nurses covered their noses with cloth, doctors exchanged glances, and paperwork was filled out without discussion. No one wanted to touch the bodies that looked more like decomposing carcasses than patients. The rot was too advanced, the infections too deep, the blood too poisoned. The treatment, if it could be called that, was nothing more than a delay of the inevitable. Beds were limited, resources scarce, and sympathy scarcer. In places where hundreds were dying, one more meant nothing. The addicts who managed to crawl into hospitals came in wrapped in rags, trembling from fever, dragging themselves across the floor. Some carried their own syringes, still clutched in their hands. They begged not for healing, but for relief. The doctors knew what they were asking for: painkillers, sedatives, anything that could blur reality. But even that was a risk. Many hospitals refused them outright, sending them away with antiseptics and instructions no one expected them to follow. There is something monstrous about a world where mercy is denied because it no longer seems practical. Those who were admitted were placed in corners, away from other patients. Sheets covered their beds, not out of cleanliness but out of shame. The air around them grew heavy with the stench of decay, making others complain until the staff had no choice but to move them again. Cleaning staff worked quickly, spraying disinfectant, scrubbing floors that still gleamed with traces of blood and pus. The addicts moaned softly, too weak to speak, too drugged to cry. They were alive but invisible, reduced to sounds that made everyone uncomfortable. Hospitals were built for healing, but these bodies could no longer be healed. They were reminders of what medicine could not fix: poverty, addiction, neglect. Some doctors spoke openly of futility. They said the wounds were beyond saving, the blood too corrupted to cleanse. Amputation might have helped if done early. But these patients never came in early. They came when bones were already visible, when the smell of rot filled entire rooms. Every needle inserted into their veins risked bursting them open. Antibiotics only delayed the process. Bandages had to be changed every hour, yet the infection always returned. In medical charts, their conditions were summarized in brief lines: necrosis advanced, unresponsive, no improvement. It was the language of quiet surrender. Families often stopped visiting long before hospitalization. For them, the shame was too heavy, the guilt too deep. Some had already sold their possessions trying to help, only to watch their loved ones return to the drug. Others simply could not bear to see what remained. When the addicts reached the hospital, they were alone, unclaimed, nameless to everyone but the staff. Their emergency contacts were blank. The phone numbers they gave were disconnected. Even the nurses, whose job was to care, avoided eye contact. The only human touch most of them received came from latex gloves. In some wards, addicts were placed next to terminal patients, the dying among the dying. The contrast was striking. One was fading from disease, the other from a choice that had never felt like a choice. Conversations were rare, but sometimes the dying patient stared at them with quiet horror, as though looking into another kind of death. The addicts did not respond. They were too far gone, too sedated, too tired. Their breathing came in uneven waves, shallow and mechanical. The monitors beside them beeped in uneven rhythms, the machines keeping time for bodies that no longer cared. The cost of treatment was impossible. Most addicts had nothing left, no jobs, no homes, no families willing to pay. The hospitals had no funding for endless care, no space for those who would never recover. Administrators called it efficiency. Doctors called it realism. Addicts were discharged back onto the streets, sometimes with limbs missing, sometimes still bleeding. They returned to the same basements, the same kitchens, the same rituals. Within days, they injected again. The cycle didn't end because the hospital had turned them away. It continued because there was nowhere else to go. If this happened today, it would be like emergency rooms refusing burn victims because the fire might start again. Outside the hospitals, the streets were full of ghosts. Former patients limped down sidewalks, their clothes hanging off skeletons. They wrapped themselves in blankets that smelled of smoke and rot. The city watched but did not interfere. To most people, they were not victims, they were warnings. The government called them criminals, the media called them monsters. Rehabilitation centres were few and underfunded, their waiting lists longer than life expectancy. When addicts did find a place, they were treated as experiments rather than people. Cold water, isolation, starvation. These were called cures. Those who survived withdrawal emerged broken. The drug was gone, but its echo remained. Their bodies were wrecked beyond repair, their minds fogged with trauma. Society had no space for them, no patience. They were denied jobs, denied homes, denied compassion. The scars on their skin mark them forever. People crossed the street to avoid them. In the rare cases when families took them back, it was only temporary. The smell, the shaking, the nightmares, all too much to bear. Before long, the addicts were alone again, walking toward the same streets, toward the same poison. Hospitals might have been the last chance, but they were not sanctuaries. They were filters that separated the salvageable from the forgotten, and the addicts always belonged to the forgotten. The idea of healing was a luxury they could no longer afford. The system didn't see people, it saw statistics, and every overdose was one less problem to manage. Krokodil addicts were not denied treatment because they could not be saved, but because saving them was no longer considered worth the effort. The doors closed, the beds emptied, and silence replaced compassion. Somewhere in the distance, another addict lit a flame under a spoon, whispering to the smoke as if it were listening. By the time Krokodil reached its full spread, Even those trained to save lives began to hesitate. Paramedics stood at the thresholds of rooms heavy with rot, their gloved hands frozen mid-air. The air itself seemed infected, thick with the smell of gasoline and decay. Every call to assist a Krokodil Addict carried a warning: wear protection, avoid contact, don't touch the wounds. The patients were not treated as people anymore, they were treated as hazards. Ambulance crews arrived wearing full protective suits, masks and goggles, as if entering the scene of a chemical spill rather than a home. The addicts, half conscious and twitching, looked up at them like children seeing ghosts, but no one reached out a hand. In those moments, time felt suspended. The responders assessed from a distance, taking notes through masks that muffled their words. They sprayed disinfectant into the air before stepping closer, their boots leaving marks on floors stained with black and red residue. The addicts coughed and shook, their skin green and splitting, the smell of death pouring from every open sore. Yet the medics rarely stayed long. The goal was not recovery, but containment. There is a quiet horror in watching people protect themselves from the living as though from the dead. Even when an ambulance took someone away, the process was cold and mechanical. Stretchers were covered with plastic sheets. The patients were wrapped tightly, like evidence. The smell clung to everything: the walls, the uniforms, the vehicles. Hospitals complained that the fumes lingered long after the patients were gone. Cleaning crews refused to work without masks. The infection was not contagious, but fear was. Soon, every call involving Krokodil was handled with dread. Some medics simply didn't respond. They left addicts where they lay, assuming death would come soon enough, and most of the time, it did. Police were called in when bodies were found days later, often when the neighbours could no longer bear the smell. Officers entered with scarves tied around their faces, holding flashlights low to the ground. The rooms they entered were dark, humid, and silent, except for the buzzing of flies. The addicts were usually found where they had fallen, on beds, floors, or next to stoves still stained from their last batch. The bodies were already in advanced decay. The officers documented the scene quickly, speaking little. Their reports were short, detached, and factual. No signs of struggle, suspected overdose, decomposition advanced. Then they left, closing the doors behind them as though sealing the problem inside. For the local police, these deaths became routine. They no longer called them tragedies, they called them statistics. The addicts had ceased to be citizens in the eyes of law enforcement. They were treated as refuse, their homes labelled as contaminated sites. Clean-up crews wore masks and gloves, dumping entire rooms worth of possessions into black bags without sorting anything. Whatever was left behind, photographs, letters, and clothes, was burned. The dead were given no funerals, only documents. If this were happening now, it would be like first responders wearing hazmat suits to collect the homeless, calling them biohazards instead of victims. The fear was not entirely irrational. The infections from Krokodil were unlike anything the authorities had seen. The wounds leaked fluids that ate through bandages. The smell was enough to make people vomit. The chemicals inside the addicts' blood made their sweat corrosive, their touch unsafe for open skin. Doctors described the fluids as toxic discharge, and word spread quickly that the addicts were dangerous to handle. Soon, even morgue workers began refusing the bodies. The corpses decomposed so fast that refrigeration barely slowed the process. Undertakers kept them outside until collection trucks arrived, the air filled with the smell of gasoline and rot. Inside the cities, some neighbourhoods became no-go zones. Ambulances refused to enter. Police went only in pairs, and residents barricaded their doors. Entire apartment blocks emptied after a few deaths, leaving behind hallways echoing with dripping pipes and silence. Stray dogs wandered through the corridors, sniffing the air where people once lived. The addicts who remained stayed behind locked doors, surrounded by stoves, syringes, and darkness. No one came to check on them anymore. Their world had shrunk to the size of a single room, where death arrived quietly and was left untouched. Occasionally, brave volunteers or journalists ventured inside. They filmed what they saw: collapsed ceilings, blackened walls, syringes scattered across floors, and the remains of human beings that barely resembled bodies. The footage was broadcast briefly, sparking outrage that faded within days. People watched from their homes, covering their mouths, then switched channels. The stories were too grotesque, too hopeless. The victims were too far gone to elicit sympathy. The narrative was simple. They did this to themselves. Even religious groups struggled to intervene. Priests came with crosses and prayers, but rarely stayed long. The air made them dizzy, the smell unbearable. The addicts, lying in their filth, stared up blankly as blessings were murmured over them. Faith had little meaning in those rooms. Redemption was an idea meant for those who could still move, still hope, still be seen. The addicts were beyond that, trapped in decay, both physical and social. They had become the unclean of modern times, and no one wanted to be touched by them. It is terrifying how quickly compassion turns into caution once the suffering looks too real. Over time, even the reports stopped. The police stopped counting, the hospitals stopped logging cases, and the news stopped writing. The deaths became background noise again. The addicts continued to die in their rooms, and when the smell grew too strong, someone would call for removal, men in masks would come, seal the door afterward, and the city would move on. No one spoke the names of the dead. No one asked where they came from. They disappeared like smoke, leaving behind only stains on walls and a silence that clung like humidity. The fear of contamination had erased empathy completely. The sight of a decaying addict no longer shocked. It repelled. Society began to treat them like objects of disease rather than victims of despair. The emergency services, once symbols of rescue, had become custodians of disposal. Their work was not to heal but to remove. Even the ones trained to save lives stopped reaching out. The gloves grew thicker, the masks tighter, the distance wider. And in that widening gap, the last thread of humanity snapped, leaving behind bodies untouched, doors unknocked, and echoes that no one wanted to claim. It stopped being an addiction long before anyone realized it. What began as a way to escape pain had turned into a form of ritualized destruction, deliberate and unrelenting. The syringe was no longer a tool of relief but a declaration. Every injection was an admission that the body had become disposable, that survival no longer meant anything. The addicts moved through their routines like worshippers at a fire they knew would consume them. The preparation was the same every time: the flick of a lighter, the swirl of liquid, the trembling of fingers, and each motion carried its own dark grace. The room filled with the smell of smoke and gasoline, and for a moment, everything went silent. Then came the injection, and with it, the quiet surrender. The burn spread quickly, coursing through veins that had already collapsed under the weight of chemical scars. The warmth was familiar, the pain expected. The body knew it was dying, but the mind refused to care. It was an act of self-immolation without flame, a slow burning from within. There is something unbearably poetic about a person choosing to dissolve rather than endure. The drug did not sedate anymore, it ignited. Blood boiled under the skin, muscles spasmed, and the eyes rolled back in fleeting ecstasy. It was not euphoria, but annihilation dressed as peace. The addicts called it the calm before the next collapse. Every organ joined in the rebellion. The heart stuttered and skipped beats, confused by the onslaught of chemicals. The lungs filled with fluid, choking quietly as the addicts leaned back, eyes unfocused. The kidneys strained against the poisons, the liver hardened like stone. The entire body became a battlefield where every part fought to die first, and yet, through it all, they kept injecting. Some had lost so much flesh that there were no veins left, so they pushed the needle into muscle, into wounds, into whatever tissue remained. The pain no longer mattered. Pain was simply proof that the fire was still burning. In the dim light of their rooms, their bodies looked like dying embers, skin cracked, oozing, glistening under the faint reflection of the flame. The stoves hissed softly, the gas leaking into the air, but no one cared. Every breath drew in fumes, every heartbeat echoed through hollow ribs. The addicts were burning themselves alive, slowly and methodically. If this were happening now, it would be like people streaming their own funerals, unaware that the audience had already turned away. The tragedy was not in the dying, it was in the repetition. They did it again and again, as if perfection could be achieved in self-destruction. The collapse of the organs was not sudden. It came like the closing of a curtain, one layer at a time. The digestive system shut down first, then the kidneys, then the liver. The heart struggled to keep pace, fluttering like a trapped bird. The brain, starved of oxygen, filled with confusion and flashes of colour. The addicts often described seeing light, warmth, or faces. They mistook hallucinations for revelation. Their bodies convulsed, but their expression softened. For a few moments, they looked serene, as if they had reached the peace they'd been chasing. But peace in this form was only decay disguised as relief. Outside those rooms, life continued with its usual noise. Cars passing, neighbours arguing, televisions humming. Inside, the addicts lay surrounded by the evidence of their own undoing. Burned spoons, empty pill packets, broken glass, and the faint outline of their bodies on the floor where they had fallen before. The air was heavy, thick with residue, as though even oxygen refused to linger. They no longer feared death. They invited it, needle by needle. Every injection was a candle lit for their own funeral, and the body, obedient to the ritual, kept burning until nothing was left. To the world, they were addicts. To themselves, they were something else entirely, participants in a slow transformation. They were erasing themselves from the inside out, turning flesh into ash and thought into silence. When they looked in mirrors, they didn't see horror anymore, they saw inevitability. The mirror was honest. It reflected not shame, but acceptance. In the glass, they watched themselves fade and didn't look away. It is terrifying how beauty can exist in the act of one's own disappearance. Doctors who examined their remains struggled to describe what they found. The internal organs looked cooked, veins ruptured, tissue liquefied. The damage was total, beyond repair, beyond comprehension. It was as though the body had decided to join the addicts in their rebellion, consuming itself from within. Medical reports spoke clinically, multi-organ failure, systemic infection, but those words were far too neat. The reality was closer to combustion. There was no screaming, no chaos in the final moments, only stillness. The addicts, half conscious, leaned against walls or beds, eyes open but unseeing. Their chests rose once, twice, then stopped. The heart, scorched and overworked, gave up quietly. The fire went out. The silence that followed was almost peaceful. Outside, someone might have passed by the building, unaware that a life had ended inside. The body cooled quickly, leaving behind only the smell of smoke, the faint trace of what had been a person. And yet, even in death, they did not vanish completely. The residue of their existence remained on every surface, on walls, on stoves, in the air itself. The poison outlived the flesh. The people who entered those rooms later said it felt like stepping into a place still alive with something invisible, something restless. The kind of silence that vibrated, the kind that waited. Krokodil addiction was no longer addiction at all, it was self-cremation. Every injection was a promise to disappear, every heartbeat a spark feeding the final fire. And somewhere beneath the smoke, the last human thought flickered faintly, wondering how long the body could burn before the soul followed. In the outskirts of Russian industrial towns, some neighbourhoods had ceased to exist in any living sense. The walls still stood, The lights still flickered at night, but the people inside were no longer part of the world beyond their windows. They were the crocodile slums, blocks of hollow buildings filled with slow-moving bodies, breathing but barely alive. The air was thick with gasoline and sweat, the hallways dim and echoing. Doors hung half open, revealing rooms cluttered with bottles, syringes, and blackened spoons. It was impossible to tell where one home ended and another began. Everything smelled the same. Everything looked the same. It was as if decay had been given an address. Those who lived there had stopped pretending to be neighbours. The addicts sat by their stoves, their skin green and peeling, their voices hoarse. Some leaned out of windows, staring blankly at the grey sky, their arms covered in bandages that no longer hid the wounds. At night, the buildings hummed with whispers and the faint hiss of gas burners. The walls absorbed it all, the groans, the coughing, the rustle of movement that never stopped. In these streets, silence did not mean peace. It meant another death. There is a strange symmetry in watching life continue in a place where everyone is already halfway gone. Children were not spared. They watched the rituals of the adults and learned them faster than anyone expected. By the age when they should have been playing in courtyards, they were already lighting matches, heating spoons, mimicking what they saw. The smell of burning chemicals filled their lungs before they even knew what clean air was. Some were injected by 12, others by 10. Their bodies could not handle it, but there was no one left to tell them not to. Parents, if still alive, sat motionless nearby, too far gone to intervene. The children grew up in rooms where death slept in every corner. The city had long given up on these districts. Garbage trucks stopped coming, mail stopped arriving, and police stopped patrolling. Even stray dogs avoided the area. When outsiders passed by, they quickened their steps, pretending not to notice the faces watching them from cracked windows. Rumours spread about what happened inside, stories of people cooking flesh by mistake, of fires burning through whole floors, of screams that lasted until dawn. The truth was simpler and worse. People were dying so slowly that no one could tell when they were still alive. The addicts shared everything: needles, food, infections, silence. Their days had no structure. Morning and night blended under flickering bulbs. They sat in groups, motionless, staring at the floor, their voices low and slurred. Occasionally, one of them fell sideways, the others glancing briefly before returning to stillness. When someone died, there was no announcement, no ritual. The body was moved to a corner and covered with a sheet, sometimes not at all. The living stepped over it, careful not to look down. Death was no longer an event, it was an inconvenience. Some of these neighbourhoods were near factories, others in abandoned mining towns. The buildings were damp, their walls swollen with mould, their staircases slick with grime. Pipes hissed constantly, dripping water mixed with chemical runoff. Every sound in those corridors carried too far. The drop of a needle, the closing of a door, the weak breath of someone trying to survive another night. Outside, snow piled against the windows, sealing them in further. The air inside was always warm and humid, filled with rot and human scent. It was a world designed to trap. There were attempts, sometimes, to send in help. Aid workers came with food and pamphlets, but they rarely returned. Their supplies were stolen, their warnings ignored. No one wanted lectures about recovery in a place where the drug had become both God and grave. The residents did not resist because resistance required energy. They simply stared. The aid workers learned to leave quickly, keeping their masks tight, their words brief. They told themselves they had tried, but deep down, they knew they had only passed through. The government called these places zones of despair. Reports were filed, promises made, and photographs taken. Nothing changed. No one wanted to allocate money to people already considered dead. The addicts were invisible in a system that measured worth by productivity. They did not vote. They did not work. They did not complain. They existed in silence, and the world responded with silence in return. If this were happening now, it would be like an entire town vanishing while the rest of the world scrolls past the headline. Fire was the most common way these buildings ended. Someone would drop a match, a stove would explode, and within minutes the flames would sweep through the hallways. No one screamed. Some tried to crawl toward the exits but collapsed before reaching them. When the fire trucks finally arrived, they found the charred remains of people who had not even attempted to flee. The reports called them victims of an accident. The locals called it release. In winter, the buildings turned silent again. Windows frosted over, and the air froze the moisture inside. The addicts huddled together under blankets, sharing heat, needles, and despair. Some died quietly in their sleep, others froze sitting up. Their bodies stayed that way until spring thawed them. When new residents moved in, usually other addicts, they didn't bother to remove the bones. The city no longer kept records. It was cheaper to let the dead remain than to clean them away. Occasionally, journalists ventured inside to capture images of the slums. Their cameras clicked in the dark, recording faces that barely resembled humans. The addicts didn't object. They didn't even look up. The flash of the camera only highlighted what the world already ignored: the peeling walls, the sunken cheeks, the piles of bodies that were technically alive. The articles made brief headlines before fading like everything else. The cycle continued, one district after another, one forgotten life stacked upon the next. By the time the authorities sealed the worst buildings, there was nothing left to save. The addicts who could still walk moved to the next block, and the process began again. The slums multiplied like open wounds across the landscape, each one a reminder of how far a society could fall while pretending not to see. The Krokodil slums were not neighbourhoods, but waiting rooms for death. No one entered to live, and no one left unchanged. Within those crumbling walls, human life flickered like candlelight, dimming one breath at a time, while outside the city turned away, pretending the fire had already gone out. When the drug reached the brain, it stripped away the last layer of humanity. Thought no longer belonged to reason, only to impulse. The addicts began to lose the boundary between what was real and what was imagined. They would sit in dark corners, their eyes wide, scanning the walls for shapes that were not there. The shadows moved differently for them, and the air whispered their names. They believed they were being watched, followed, hunted. Every flicker of light became a signal, every creak of the floorboards a warning. Their paranoia was not a passing state, it was their new reality. The mind, once dulled by euphoria, had turned against them completely. At first, it began as small suspicions. Someone was outside the door, someone was listening, someone had poisoned the water. But soon, the fear expanded until everything was a threat. They smashed mirrors because the reflections smirked at them, tore the wires from radios that they believed were transmitting their thoughts, and covered windows with blankets to block invisible eyes. The world outside no longer existed as a place but as an enemy. There is something terrifyingly logical in madness when you're the only sane one left in your world. Their aggression followed soon after. They destroyed their own homes in bursts of uncontrollable rage, furniture overturned, walls scarred with knife marks. Some attacked strangers, others turned on themselves. The distinction no longer mattered. They screamed into the night, sometimes in pain, sometimes in triumph, until their voices failed. Their bodies were thin and weak, yet the violence that came from them was monstrous. Adrenaline replaced strength, and delusion replaced fear. The drug fed on their emotions like a parasite, twisting every thought into something sharp. The hallucinations became physical. They felt insects crawling under their skin, biting, tearing. Some clawed at their own arms to dig them out, their nails stained with blood. Others bit into their hands or legs, convinced something was moving inside. The pain didn't stop them. It proved that they were right. When the wounds opened, they laughed or cried, unable to tell which sound belonged to which feeling. If this happened today, it would be like people live streaming their breakdowns while audiences watched in fascination instead of horror. Neighbours told stories of screams that lasted for hours, of windows shattering, of footsteps running through hallways at night. Sometimes, people disappeared for days, only to be found hiding under staircases, whispering to themselves. Their voices were incoherent, fragments of memory and fear. They muttered about demons, about poison, about being dissected while still alive. The walls of the slums seemed to absorb those voices until every building hummed with madness. Inside their skulls, the brain was decaying as fast as the body. The blood vessels ruptured, neurons misfired, chemical balance dissolved. It was not only a mental breakdown, it was literal damage. The brain was burning from the inside out. Medical reports described holes forming in the white matter, areas of necrosis spreading through tissue. The addicts were not simply hallucinating, their brains were dying in real time. Yet the hallucinations made them feel alive. They thought they could see through the world's lies, that they had touched something divine in the pain. The violence extended beyond the walls of their homes. In the streets, addicts fought each other without reason. Fights broke out over imaginary insults, stolen syringes, or even the sound of another person's breathing. Some carried knives or broken bottles, waving them at invisible figures. Police avoided getting close, shouting from a distance for them to drop their weapons. Sometimes they did not respond. Sometimes they lunged. The encounters usually ended in blood, though rarely by gunfire. Most of the addicts collapsed mid-charge, their bodies too exhausted to match their rage. Inside the brain, every pleasure circuit was broken. The drug no longer brought euphoria, it brought chaos. The dopamine that once flooded their minds now created only confusion and compulsion. They injected not to feel good, but to stop feeling anything at all. Between doses, they twitched and muttered, unable to sit still. They scratched their faces until the skin came off. Some tore their hair out strand by strand. Others stared at the ceiling for hours, mumbling prayers to no one. The line between ecstasy and agony had vanished. There were moments of eerie lucidity when the addicts realized what they had become. For a few seconds, clarity returned, enough to see the filth around them, the scars on their bodies, the fear in their eyes. Some tried to stop then, throwing away their syringes, smashing their spoons, but within hours, the craving returned, accompanied by shaking, vomiting, and hallucinations so intense that they crawled back to the drug as if it were salvation. The brain demanded it, the same brain that was killing them. It is haunting to think that self-awareness, when it returns, only makes the suffering worse. By the time the hallucinations became permanent, they were no longer capable of fear. Their minds had burned through it. They drifted between violence and silence, between screaming and stillness. Some sat in corners, rocking back and forth, smiling faintly at visions no one else could see. Others ran into the streets naked, shouting at invisible voices, collapsing into puddles that reflected only emptiness. The police stopped chasing them. The neighbours stopped looking. They were ghosts in daylight, their bodies moving on borrowed time. In the final stages, the mind turned on itself entirely. The addicts became prisoners inside their skulls, trapped between delusion and decay. They forgot names, places, and even language. The brain, too damaged to sustain memory, replaced it with noise, colours, flashes, and fragments of sound. They spoke to people who weren't there and listened to answers that never came. In those last moments, they weren't aware of dying. For them, death had already happened. It was just taking its time to catch up. Krokodil did not only destroy the body, it devoured the mind, piece by piece, until nothing remained but echoes of thought and motion. The addicts fought shadows, tore at themselves, and vanished into madness so complete that even pain stopped meaning anything. In the ruins of their brains, the drug found its final victory silence that no longer needed a scream. They moved through the streets like remnants of a world that had already ended. Bodies that were not quite alive, not yet dead, drifting between alleyways and abandoned buildings. The locals called them the living dead, and the name fit too well. Their steps were uneven, their bodies twisted and fragile, the skin stretched thin over bones. Limbs hung loosely or were missing entirely, sleeves pinned or wrapped where arms once were. They stumbled rather than walked, guided by instinct more than sight. Some dragged their feet, leaving trails of blackened footprints that smelled faintly of chemicals and rot. They did not speak, they did not cry out, they did not seem to feel. They existed in motion, mechanical and without direction, as if driven by something deeper than survival. Faces that had once been human had become unrecognizable. Cheeks hollowed out, lips cracked, eyes yellowed and lifeless. The skin was darkened by toxins, peeling in places where new flesh could not grow. When they blinked, their eyelids stuck for a moment before sliding open again, revealing eyes that saw everything and nothing. Some smiled, a crooked, lifeless curve of the mouth that never reached the eyes. Others kept their mouths half open, breathing through gaps where teeth had fallen away. Their hair came out in clumps, leaving patches of scalp exposed like scars. They no longer tried to cover themselves. Shame had no place left to live. There is something more disturbing about those who keep moving after life has already left them than those who lie still. They wandered in groups sometimes, drawn together not by companionship but by habit. They followed one another down empty streets, toward the same burned-out apartments, the same corners where dealers once stood. When one of them collapsed, the others stepped around the body without pause, as if death were just a brief interruption. The smell that followed them made people cross the road, cover their faces, whisper prayers. Even stray dogs avoided them. Some city workers referred to them as walkers, saying it with a nervous laugh that died quickly. The absence of pain was both a gift and a curse. They could press their hands against open wounds and feel nothing. They could burn themselves on cooking flames and not flinch. The nerve endings had died, the brain no longer capable of registering warning. Pain had been replaced by craving. The only sensation that remained was the need, the constant, unrelenting hunger for the drug. They injected wherever they could, using legs, necks, feet, sometimes even the flesh of the face. The sight was unbearable, yet they did it calmly, almost ritualistically. Their faces barely moved as the needle entered. No fear, no hesitation, just the routine of survival. When they stood still, they looked like statues left out in the rain too long. Their clothes hung from them like loose skin, their bodies thin and rigid. In the daylight, they cast long shadows that made them appear taller, almost skeletal. At night, under streetlights, their movements became slow and jerky, their silhouettes swaying like ghosts. People whispered that they were cursed, that they had already died but didn't realize it yet. The truth was simpler. They had burned away everything that made them human, and what was left refused to stop breathing. Authorities tried to keep them off the streets. Police cars stopped them at corners, asking questions that went unanswered. When they didn't respond, they were pushed aside or taken away. Some were sent to shelters, others to hospitals, most to nowhere. But the next day, they always appeared again, walking, searching, their eyes fixed on something only they could see. If this happened now, it would be like watching people move through a city as background noise, visible to everyone, acknowledged by no one. In the winter, their bodies stiffened further. They shuffled through snow with bare hands, the skin cracking from the cold, leaking fluid that froze before it hit the ground. They wrapped themselves in rags, not for warmth, but for modesty, a habit left from a life they barely remembered. Some slept standing against walls, others curled on steps, their heads dropping forward, motionless for hours. Passers-by thought they were dead until a faint movement proved otherwise. Even then, no one stopped. The children who saw them cried at first, then grew used to them. They learned to step around the bodies on sidewalks, to ignore the moans echoing through courtyards. The living dead became part of the scenery, another symptom of the city's decay. Their reflection appeared in shop windows, distorted and trembling, but they never looked at it. They had no interest in mirrors anymore. There was nothing left inside them to recognize. Every few days, one would fall and not rise again. Their companions didn't mourn. They stood for a while, staring at the body as if waiting for it to move. When it didn't, they continued. Within hours, others came to take what little was left. Shoes, coats, belts. The corpse blended into the snow, into the dust, into the memory of those who had stopped counting the dead long ago. There was no mourning because there was no one left to mourn. Doctors, when they did encounter them, used the word zombification. It was not meant as poetry, but as a diagnosis. The lack of movement, the rigidity, the absence of expression, all pointed to neurological decay. The brain was no longer connected to emotion, the body no longer to sensation. They were walking autopsies, physical proof of what addiction could sculpt when given enough time. Medical papers described them clinically, but no words could capture the reality of their presence. To see them move was to witness the slow death of instinct itself. The tragedy was that they didn't want to live, but they couldn't die. The body clung to existence even as everything else surrendered. They ate when forced, slept only when exhaustion took over, and woke to start again. There was no end, only repetition. Even death seemed hesitant to claim them. They were neither victims nor monsters. They were reminders of what remained after all sense, all pain, all will had been stripped away. The Krokodil Addicts became shadows of their former selves, living corpses that refused to rest. Their bodies moved through streets that no longer wanted them, untouched by pain, driven by a need stronger than life itself. In their hollow faces, one could see the final truth of the drug. It did not kill quickly, because it preferred to watch. Not everyone died from Krokodil. Some remained, if existing without a pulse of life could be called remaining. They moved through cities like echoes, visible but untouchable, wrapped in layers of cloth that no longer protected anything. Their bodies were a patchwork of wounds and scars, stitched together by willpower and addiction. On the streets, they walked slowly, heads lowered, their arms covered in rags soaked with dirt and dried blood. From a distance, they looked like survivors of a fire that never stopped burning. Up close, they looked like reminders of what it meant to keep living when life had already left. People crossed the street when they appeared. Mothers pulled children closer. Shopkeepers closed their doors. No one wanted to look, but everyone saw them. Their presence disturbed the rhythm of normal life, a small fracture in the illusion of safety. They carried the smell of gasoline and decay, their footsteps uneven, their breathing audible in the cold. The air seemed to follow them, heavy and still, as though even the wind refused to come near. There is something cruel about survival when it no longer feels like a victory. They begged without speaking, holding out trembling hands that were little more than bone and bandage. The coins dropped into their palms sounded louder than they should have, sharp against the silence around them. They did not say thank you. Gratitude was a luxury of those who believed in tomorrow. The money disappeared into pockets filled with syringes, and soon after they disappeared too, slipping into alleyways where no one followed. They were creatures of habit, and habit was stronger than pity. Some carried old photographs folded and worn. Others clutched plastic bags filled with medicine bottles and scraps of food. They slept beneath bridges, near heating vents, in the corners of train stations. Security guards shooed them away, pretending not to notice the wounds, the smell, the tremors. When they woke, it was always the same ritual check for the syringe. check for the lighter, find a place to disappear for a while. The drug did not kill them, but it erased the boundaries between days. There were moments when the light hit them just right, on a morning street, on a snowy curb, and for a second, they looked human again. You could imagine who they had been: a son, a mother, a lover, a friend. Their faces softened, their eyes reflected something more than emptiness. Then the moment passed, and the mask of ruin settled back in. The drug had not taken their lives, but had stolen the memory of what being alive felt like. If this happened now, it would be like watching survivors of an apocalypse beg for shelter in a city that caused the disaster. Some of them spoke, though rarely. Their voices were cracked and dry, words scattered between breaths. They told stories that no one believed, how they had once worked in factories, how they had families, how they had tried to stop. Their speech wandered, looping back into fragments. They described sensations rather than memories: the taste of metal, the sound of water boiling, the heat that crawled under the skin. It was as if their minds could no longer distinguish between what had happened and what was imagined. Listeners nodded, uncomfortable, waiting for the chance to walk away. The authorities treated them as nuisances. They were removed from public squares, chased from markets, taken to shelters that could hold them for a few days at best. Some were sterilized, shaved, documented, and then sent back to the streets. The reports called them chronic dependents. No one called them people. They became part of the urban landscape, like graffiti, like trash, like noise that could not be silenced but could be ignored. In winter, their rags froze stiff. They warmed themselves with matches, holding flames close enough to burn but not enough to die. Their hands were swollen and cracked, wrapped in whatever cloth they could find. Some covered the remains of their arms with old socks. Others tied plastic bags around their legs to hide the wounds. The rags were not for warmth. They were to hide what scared others to see. Underneath the layers, their skin was mottled and green, the veins dark and visible. The world looked at them and saw infection. They looked back and saw indifference. They knew what people thought. They could feel the stares, hear the whispers. Some laughed at them, others crossed themselves. A few gave money, not out of pity but superstition, as if helping one would keep the curse away. The addicts accepted everything wordlessly. Pride was useless where the body was already beyond saving. Each coin meant another moment of quiet, another chance to drift away in the numb warmth the drug offered. They were not chasing joy anymore, they were chasing absence. Sometimes they gathered near train stations, sitting in lines along the walls, eyes half closed, their heads nodded in unison, a silent rhythm only they could feel. They did not speak to one another, but there was understanding in their stillness. The living dead recognized their own kind. When one collapsed, the others barely moved, only glanced briefly before returning to stillness. They did not help because they could not. To reach out meant to remember, and memory was heavier than death. For the rest of the city, there were warnings. Teachers told children to stay away. Parents used their names as threats, and newspapers called them examples of moral decay. Yet the same society that condemned them had created the hunger that kept them alive. The factories that laid them off, the governments that cut aid, the streets that sold the poison, all had a hand in keeping them walking. Their existence was not a failure of willpower, it was evidence of neglect that had outlived compassion. And still, they wandered. They survived winter after winter, sickness after sickness. They didn't die because death required something to take. Krokodil had already taken everything. What remained was endurance stripped of purpose. The ones who lived became shadows that refused to fade. They drifted through the city wrapped in rags, the last living proof of a nightmare that had already ended for everyone else. Their steps were quiet, their eyes hollow, their presence unbearable. They were living warnings no one dared to hear, and the silence that followed them was the city's confession. For those left behind, the suffering did not end with the addict. It lingered in the walls, in photographs, in the air that no one wanted to breathe anymore. Families lived with the ghost of someone who was still technically alive. The addiction became a presence that never left the house, invisible but heavy, pressing down on every conversation and every silence. Mothers learned to stop waiting for the sound of footsteps at the door. Fathers threw away old clothes and locked the rooms shut. Siblings avoided questions about where their brother or sister had gone. To admit the truth was to admit failure, and failure was harder to bear than loss. The image of what the addicts had become was unbearable. Those who had once been children, students, or workers now looked like corpses that refused to rest. Families who tried to visit often froze at the threshold, unable to step closer. The smell alone was enough to drive them away, but the eyes were worse. They still recognized their loved ones, but behind their eyes was nothing familiar. The body spoke, but the soul had already gone. Some families turned away mid-sentence, others pretended not to see when their relatives begged outside markets or train stations. There is no cruelty sharper than pretending someone never existed simply because it hurts to remember. Neighbours knew too. They heard the coughing, the muttering, the sounds of collapse. They smelled the rot seeping from the rooms. But instead of help, they called the police. It was easier to treat the situation as a disturbance than a tragedy. The presence of authorities meant they didn't have to feel guilty. The addicts were removed like trash, and the neighbours congratulated themselves for cleaning their street. No one asked where those people were taken, or whether they came back. The idea of infection, social, moral, or physical, was enough to justify distance. Families that tried to hide the truth lived under constant shame. Relatives whispered, friends disappeared, and employers avoided them. It was as if the addiction spread by reputation alone. Parents stopped attending community events. Children changed schools. The family name, once ordinary, became a warning. People lowered their voices when it was mentioned. Some households moved away entirely, leaving behind the apartment where the addict had lived, the stains on the walls, the smell that no amount of cleaning could erase. If this happened today, it would be like deleting someone's entire existence from every photo, message, and memory just to make life look tidy again. Inside the home, silence took over. Conversations ended before they began. Meals were eaten without words. The absence sat between them like a person. Every noise, a door closing, a phone ringing, carried the weight of fear. They avoided using the addict's name. It was easier to say them or that one. The few who still tried to reach out were treated as foolish. It's no use. Others said, they're already gone. And in a way, they were right. By the time Krokodil had taken hold, the addict was no longer part of the living world. Some parents still visited the places where their children were last seen. They brought food that was never eaten, medicine that was never used. They waited for hours, hoping for a glimpse, and sometimes they got one. A figure limping in the distance, wrapped in rags, face half covered. Recognition came and passed in a heartbeat. The parent would freeze, not knowing whether to call out or stay silent. To speak would mean breaking the fragile illusion that their child might come home again one day. To stay silent meant watching them vanish forever. Both choices felt like betrayal. In the countryside, news travelled more slowly but reached just the same. Families received letters or phone calls from distant relatives saying the same words found: hospital, dead. Some didn't even get that. The body was unclaimed, buried in unmarked graves, and listed as unknown. The state handled the paperwork, and that was the end. Funerals were rare. Grief had no place to rest. The families who still cared lit candles in private, whispering prayers that even they didn't believe. The others learned to bury their pain in denial. It was easier to say nothing than to explain what had happened. Communities began to fracture. People avoided entire neighbourhoods rumoured to harbour addicts. Those who once shared food and conversation stopped visiting each other's homes. Fear spread faster than the drug itself. When someone disappeared, it was not discussed. When someone died, the burial was done quietly at night. The word addict became an accusation. It meant shame, failure, contamination. Families carried that stigma for generations. Children grew up hearing the story of an uncle or sister who went wrong, but were never told the details. The silence was inherited like a curse. Some tried to help, but compassion was a dangerous thing. Bringing food to an addict meant risking judgment. Speaking about addiction meant risking isolation. Churches gave sermons about sin and redemption, but few offered actual comfort. The divide between the clean and the unclean widened until no bridge could cross it. The addicts were no longer seen as victims, but as mistakes, living proof of what happened when you stepped out of line. Even after death, their names remained untouchable. Families erased them from family trees, destroyed their photos, and changed their stories to protect what was left of their pride. The greatest cruelty of Krokodil was not only what it did to the body, but what it did to the bonds between people. It turned love into fear, compassion into disgust, and memory into silence. Families learned to live with absences that had faces. They survived by pretending they had nothing to mourn. But in doing so, they lost more than their loved ones. They lost their ability to grieve. Krokodil killed slowly, but isolation killed faster. Families shut their doors, neighbours looked away, and the addicts died twice, once in body and once in memory. In the end, silence became the only inheritance left behind, echoing through homes that refused to say their names. Death did not arrive like a mercy for Krokodil addicts. It came slowly, clumsily, as if reluctant to take what it had already ruined. The process was neither swift nor silent. It stretched across days, sometimes weeks, turning the body into a theatre of decay. Blood loss was constant, seeping from wounds that no longer closed. The smell of iron filled the air, mixing with the sharp sting of chemicals and burned skin. They bled from places that should never bleed, from cracks in the flesh that had forgotten how to heal. The veins collapsed, the organs shut down, and still the heart continued, stubborn and cruel. Each beat was weaker than the last, yet it refused to stop. The end often began with fever. The infection spread quietly at first, crawling through muscle and blood, finding every opening. The skin grew hot, the pulse quickened, the eyes glazed with confusion. Then came the shaking, the gasping, the slow collapse into shock. The blood pressure dropped, the lungs filled with fluid, and the kidneys shut down. The body began drowning in itself. Some cried out for water, others simply stared at the ceiling, unable to move. Their breathing turned shallow, their mouths opened and closed like fish pulled from the river. They were conscious enough to know they were dying, but too weak to stop it. There is something almost merciful about dying fast, which is why Krokodil never allowed it. The infections rarely stayed local. They moved inward, devouring tissue and bone until the body became its own source of poison. Sepsis set in, the blood turning dark, the skin mottled. The fever burned until it emptied the body of sweat. When the temperature finally dropped, it was not recovery. It was the moment before the end. Doctors called it septic shock, but the addicts did not need terms. They felt it as a slow fading, a heaviness that began at the core and spread outward. One by one, the systems failed, and the body folded in on itself like something collapsing into silence. Some deaths came violently, in rooms where addicts cooked their own doses. Small fires often broke out. Gas leaks were common, stoves tipped over, and the air filled with fumes. Flames caught on curtains, on clothes, on skin slick with oil and residue. They burned alive in a half-conscious stupor, unable to move fast enough to escape. Neighbours would smell smoke long before realising what it was. By the time help arrived, it was never a rescue, it was a collection. The walls turned black, the floor stuck to boots, and what remained of the addict was fused to the metal pot still sitting on the stove. Not all burned instantly. Some managed to crawl outside, their skin melting in ribbons, eyes open but blind with heat. They collapsed in snow or mud, steam rising from their bodies, the air filled with the sound of shallow breaths. People watched from windows, too afraid to help, too fascinated to look away. Fire trucks came eventually, their lights reflecting off the bodies that no longer looked human. The report said accident during production, as if it were something mechanical, not human. The tragedy was filed away like routine paperwork. In the final stages, time became meaningless. Hours stretched into blurred patterns of light and shadow. The addicts no longer screamed or fought, they simply waited. The pain had long since passed the point of recognition. Their faces were empty, their eyes unfocused, the heart beat on defiant, as though refusing to let them rest. The body clung to life with the desperation of a machine that doesn't know how to stop. The addicts themselves didn't want to live, they wanted the process to end. But Krokodil did not grant the dignity of choice. It kept them suspended between agony and oblivion. If this were happening now, it would be like watching a machine grind itself to dust, still running long after its purpose had disappeared. When the heart finally failed, it wasn't dramatic. There was no final gasp, no struggle. It simply stopped, often between one blink and the next. The body stiffened, the colour drained, and the smell intensified. The rooms where they died stayed warm for hours, the air dense and still. Sometimes, a candle continued to burn nearby, untouched by the chaos. The silence that followed was so complete that even flies hesitated. Those who witnessed the deaths rarely spoke of them. Other addicts stepped over the bodies or covered them with blankets, waiting for someone to remove them. Days could pass before anyone came. The heat accelerated the decay, turning the room into a chemical grave. The sheets darkened, the floors stuck underfoot, and the air grew too thick to breathe. By the time the authorities arrived, the body had already begun to merge with its surroundings. They wrapped what remained in plastic, carried it out, and left behind the smell of something that never entirely went away. The families, if they were notified at all, received little more than a call and a report. The details were vague, found deceased, cause under investigation. No one wanted to describe the real condition of the bodies. There were no open caskets, no proper farewells. Cremation was the only option, though most were burned in state facilities without ceremony. The ashes were often unclaimed. Some were scattered, others stored in boxes labelled only with numbers. The people they had once been, names, voices, memories, ended as anonymous remains in government storage. The city adapted to the presence of death. Clean-up teams worked quietly at night, scraping residue from walls, repainting doors, and airing out the smell with industrial fans. By morning, the buildings looked ordinary again, as if nothing had happened. The illusion of cleanliness returned, fragile but convincing. But for those who had seen inside, who had smelled the air and heard the faint sound of burning, the image never left. It stayed behind their eyes, resurfacing in silence, reminding them of what hid beneath the surface of the city. Death by Krokodil was not a moment. It was a process that devoured life piece by piece until nothing was left to take. The body bled, burned, and surrendered in slow motion, while the world outside moved on, and somewhere in the smoke and silence, the line between mercy and cruelty disappeared completely. In the final hours, silence filled every space. It was not peaceful, not sacred, just the kind of silence that came when there was nothing left to say. The addicts no longer spoke. Their mouths had forgotten how. The jawbones, softened and misaligned by decay, no longer held shape. Lips hung loosely, teeth long gone, tongues swollen and cracked. When they tried to make sounds, only air escaped, a dry rattle, a sigh mistaken for breathing. The body wanted to speak, to cry, to call for someone, but the mouth had stopped belonging to language. Every word they might have said had already dissolved somewhere between pain and numbness. The nurses, when there were any, rarely stayed near. They adjusted the sheets, checked the pulse, wrote a note, and left. The addicts lay motionless under dim lights, their eyes half open, fixed on ceilings stained with moisture. There were no visitors, no families waiting in the hallways, no friends standing at the bedside. The dying were alone, surrounded by the hum of medical machines that offered only rhythm, not comfort. The air smelled of antiseptic, sweat, and something faintly metallic. Outside, the world went on. Buses passed, people laughed, and the sun still rose. But in those small, forgotten rooms, the distance between life and death shrank to the width of a breath. There is something unbearable about a death so quiet that even the walls refuse to echo it. The addict's last movements were small. A twitch of fingers, a shallow gasp, sometimes a slow turn of the head, as if listening for a sound that never came. Their eyes wandered, reflecting the dull light above them. They did not fight or resist. They had long stopped believing in rescue. The final moments came not with fear, but with exhaustion, as if sleep had finally agreed to take them. Some exhaled softly and never inhaled again, their mouths falling slightly open. The silence that followed was absolute, thick and final. The nurses noted the time, pulled a sheet over the face, and walked away. The dead were not mourned. There were no tears shed, no prayers whispered. Their names were recorded on hospital charts that would soon be filed and forgotten. In the morgues, bodies arrived faster than they could be processed. Tables filled, then floors. The workers wore masks not only for the smell, but for the thought of what these people had been. Skin peeled when touched, and the faces had collapsed inward, leaving no features to recognize. Tag numbers replaced names. Unidentified became the most common word in the reports. There were no funerals, no flowers, no gatherings, no words of remembrance. The state handled the remains as efficiently as possible. Trucks carried the bodies to cremation centres on the outskirts of the city, the air thick with smoke and quiet machinery. Inside, the bodies were stacked in rows, wrapped in plastic and sheets. The attendants moved quickly, unbothered by the weight. Death had become an industrial process, repetitive and cold. Flames consumed what remained of flesh, the fire crackling faintly beneath the whir of fans. No one looked directly at it for long. When the work was done, the ashes were collected into metal trays and pushed aside. Some were placed into small containers, unmarked except for numbers etched on lids. Others were swept together in bulk, mixed, and discarded. A few were stored temporarily before being taken for mass disposal. The collective cremations were efficient. Dozens burned together, their smoke rising into the sky like a signal no one bothered to read. No names, no songs, no voices, just ash and air. If this happened today, it would be like deleting 1,000 faces from existence in a single click. Their stories erased faster than they had lived them. The families who still existed rarely knew the details. Official letters arrived weeks later, written in plain, bureaucratic language. "We regret to inform you," followed by dates, codes, and procedural phrases. The tone was neutral, careful not to suggest emotion. For some, even those letters never came. The bodies had been too damaged to identify, too long unclaimed. The families lit candles at home, guessing at the day, whispering names that no one answered. There were no graves to visit, no ashes to collect. Grief had nowhere to go. In the places where they had lived, life resumed quickly. The rooms were emptied, cleaned, and painted over. New tenants arrived, unaware of what had happened there. The air, though scrubbed, carried faint traces of something unshakable. A smell that returned when the room grew warm, a spot on the floor that would not fade. People said nothing about it. Memory was an inconvenience, and forgetting was easier. The few doctors who had witnessed too many deaths began to grow numb. They stopped looking into patients' eyes, stopped asking about names. Death had become routine, stripped of all its weight. It wasn't a tragedy anymore, it was data. They recorded symptoms, noted times, filled reports, and moved on. The rhythm of bureaucracy was the only thing that survived. Compassion had long since been replaced by protocol. For the addicts, the final silence was both punishment and release. The drug had stolen their voices long before death finished the job. Whatever words they might have spoken, apologies, regrets, pleas, remained trapped behind ruined jaws and swollen tongues. They left the world wordlessly, and the world responded with the same silence. There was no outcry, no memory, no trace. Only the faint hum of machines and the slow turning of fire. The last words of Krokodil Addicts were not spoken, they were erased. Their deaths came without witnesses, without mourning, without sound. In the end, they vanished as quietly as they had lived, their silence rising into the air like smoke that no one cared to see. They did not begin as monsters or ghosts. They were once girls who laughed too loudly in crowded rooms and boys who stayed up too late dreaming of better cities. They had soft hands and plans, and they believed, like everyone else, that pain could be managed if one just tried hard enough. For some, that pain came from loneliness. For others, it came from hunger, cold, or the endless grind of surviving without purpose. The drug appeared like a friend, cheap, forgiving, and warm. It did not ask questions, it promised quiet. The first time was almost gentle, a small relief after years of hardship. No one ever thinks the first escape will be the last. At first, it was social. They shared needles the way others shared cigarettes, laughing, joking, unaware of how quickly laughter would turn to silence. The euphoria came fast, electric, spreading through veins like light through water. It was warmth that drowned thought. The world softened, the noise faded, and for a few precious minutes, everything felt right. The edges of reality blurred just enough to make it bearable. They thought they had found a balance, just enough to feel alive without falling apart. It is almost tragic how easily the mind mistakes relief for safety. Then came the habit. One day blurred into the next, and doses grew heavier, mixtures stronger. Their skin changed before they noticed. Bruises didn't heal. Sleep vanished. They stopped meeting friends, stopped answering calls, and stopped going home. The faces that once smiled in mirrors became strangers. They told themselves it was temporary, that they could stop any time. But time itself began to unravel. Morning and night became meaningless. The body demanded, and the mind obeyed. The craving was no longer pleasure, it was survival. The streets were filled with people who looked half alive, their clothes torn, their lips cracked and grey. They traded what they owned, sometimes what they were, for another dose. The alleys became their homes, the concrete their beds. They whispered to each other, sharing recipes for poison like secrets of hope. They believed they were still in control, even as their hands trembled and their veins collapsed. The fantasy of being fine was the last comfort they allowed themselves. No one could tell them otherwise. To admit the truth was to face the horror of what they had become. Some still tried to dress neatly, comb their hair, and pretend normalcy. They walked into shops, into homes, into hospitals, and people recoiled without understanding why. The smell of rot followed them. Their eyes, once bright, were now dim and unfocused, the pupils pinned into stillness. They smiled politely, but their faces no longer matched their gestures. They looked like echoes of the people they used to be. If this were today, they would be the ones scrolling through screens at dawn, pretending not to fall apart while the world kept scrolling past them. In the beginning, their families searched for them. Posters appeared, phone calls were made, neighbours whispered, some were found. But the sight was unbearable. They were no longer children. no longer even human in the familiar sense. Their skin hung in folds, their teeth were gone, and their voices cracked when they spoke. Parents turned away not from hate, but from disbelief. The transformation was too cruel to comprehend. What had started as curiosity, a small act of rebellion, had become an irreversible descent. Friends stopped visiting, lovers left quietly, employers erased their names. Even the police grew tired of picking them up. They were no longer people with stories, they were problems to be removed. Their names slipped out of conversations until no one said them anymore. The world forgot, and the addicts forgot themselves. They stopped using mirrors because reflection had become an accusation. In the haze between high and hunger, they lost track of birthdays, of seasons, of time itself. They became part of the background, moving shadows under bridges, figures huddled near fires that burned out faster than they could find warmth. They still dreamed, though the dreams grew stranger. Some saw themselves as they once were, young, healthy, untouched. Others saw nothing but white light that dissolved their bodies. The line between hallucination and memory disappeared. Sometimes they laughed for no reason, remembering a life that no longer existed. The laughter always ended in coughing, the kind that tasted of blood. Hope came and went like a fever. A few tried to stop, swearing to themselves that they would, but withdrawal hit like an iron hammer, shaking them to pieces. They always returned. As their numbers grew, entire districts changed. Abandoned buildings became shelters, then graveyards. People learned to walk faster, to avoid eye contact. Officials talked of cleanup, of policy, but no one spoke of the people behind the statistics. The addicts were erased even before they died, their humanity traded for disgust. They were not mourned, not remembered, not forgiven. The city absorbed them like waste, efficient and indifferent. Yet somewhere deep inside, the smallest trace of who they had been still lingered, a memory of sunlight, a laugh, a name. It flickered weakly, like a candle struggling in the wind, refusing to die even as the body crumbled. That flicker was what made their fate so unbearable. They were not villains or monsters. They were reminders of how quickly despair could disguise itself as relief, and how thin the border was between comfort and destruction. They once dreamed of becoming something more, but Krokodil taught them that dreams could decay, too. Beneath every scar and missing limb was the outline of who they used to be, faint but still there. And as the fires burned and the silence deepened, their forgotten names floated somewhere in the smoke, waiting for someone to remember them. The world did not try to help them, it only stared. The faces of Krokodil Addicts became entertainment. Their ruined bodies turned into headlines and documentaries. Reporters came with cameras, doctors came with gloves, and strangers came with curiosity. They filmed the shaking hands, the hollow eyes, the grey skin peeling from bone. They called it awareness, but it was spectacle. The addicts, barely alive, became shock material. Their names disappeared, replaced by labels like the living dead of Russia. The tragedy turned into content, and the world watched from behind screens, horrified but fascinated, disgusted but unable to look away. It is strange how quickly pity turns into voyeurism when suffering belongs to someone else. Television crews moved carefully through the ruined neighbourhoods, stepping over puddles of oil and broken glass. They pointed their lenses at people sitting motionless on doorsteps, their arms wrapped in dirty bandages. Some addicts looked directly into the camera, too dazed to care, too tired to hide. The interviews were short, often useless, but the images spoke for themselves, faces collapsing into skulls, limbs blackened and stiff, voices that sounded more like whispers than speech. These images flooded the media, winning awards and spreading horror. The journalists said they wanted to raise awareness, but awareness faded once the cameras turned off. The addicts were still there, trembling in the same alleys, waiting for another dose, online. The photos spread faster than compassion. Forums and social media labelled them as zombies, walking corpses, human waste. People shared the pictures as proof of the decay of society, or as warnings for others. But few wondered what had brought those people to this point. The internet turned their suffering into a meme, a visual thrill that scrolled by in seconds. Every click erased another layer of their humanity. People stared at the wounds, zoomed in on the faces, commented with disbelief, then went back to their meals. The addict's agony became background noise for daily life, filed between advertisements and celebrity gossip. If this happened today, it would trend for a week and then vanish, buried under the next scandal. Government spoke of numbers, not lives. Officials denied there was an epidemic, calling it an isolated issue, a result of poor personal choices. They issued statements about responsibility and morality, not treatment or prevention. The addicts were blamed for their own destruction. It was easier that way, cleaner, more convenient. To acknowledge the truth would mean admitting failure, and failure was not something states liked to document. Behind closed doors, they knew the scale. Hospitals overflowed, police collected corpses daily, and yet no one dared to call it what it was. The statistics were adjusted, the reports softened, the silence was deliberate. In the medical community, frustration turned into resignation. Doctors wrote papers, gave interviews, tried to warn about the toxicity of homemade drugs, but their voices drowned under bureaucracy. Funding was scarce, research limited, and compassion thinner still. Some doctors stopped treating addicts altogether, calling them lost causes. The wounds were too deep, the infections too advanced. They were told to focus on recoverable patients. It was a quiet form of triage, the living separated from the doomed. The addicts became invisible, except when their pictures appeared in magazines. In the neighbourhoods where Krokodil had taken hold, the stigma was heavier than the sickness itself. Neighbours whispered but didn't intervene. Landlords evicted tenants who looked too thin, too pale, too strange. Children were told not to walk near certain buildings, not to touch anything left on the ground. The addicts moved through these spaces like ghosts, both present and unwanted. The world saw them only as warnings, not as people. When someone died, the reaction was not grief but relief. One less body on the street, one less reminder of what society had chosen to ignore. Yet curiosity persisted. Documentaries continued to be made. Students wrote theses. Photographers chased the perfect shot. Each project claimed to expose the horror, but horror had already become familiar. The images lost their power over time. Viewers no longer flinched. They scrolled faster. The addict's suffering was no longer shocking, it was expected. The world had grown used to the sight of decay, and that familiarity was perhaps the cruelest part. Once the grotesque becomes normal, there is no urgency to change it. In some circles, the story of crocodile addicts became a cautionary tale, a symbol of moral failure. Politicians spoke of it when they wanted to appear serious about crime. Religious groups used it as proof of spiritual emptiness. Everyone found a way to use the addict's pain for their own narrative, but the addicts themselves were absent from those stories. Their voices were gone, their bodies too damaged to testify. They had become examples, not people. They existed only to prove a point that others had already decided. In the media archives, their faces still linger. Rows of photos labelled with dates and locations. No names, just faces staring blankly into cameras, unaware that this would be their last trace in the world. Some are shown in schools now, warnings for future generations. Teachers explain the dangers, students take notes, and then the lesson ends. The faces fade from the projector, replaced by other slides, other warnings. The addicts die again each time they're used as material for fear. It is almost impossible to say which is worse, the suffering itself or the way it was consumed. There was no empathy left in the gaze that recorded them. The eyes behind the camera wanted truth, but truth was too large to fit in a frame. The journalists filmed the consequences but never asked about the causes. Poverty, despair, neglect. All of it stayed out of focus. The result was clean, cinematic suffering, ready to be broadcast without context. It satisfied the hunger for horror while keeping the viewers safe from guilt. The addicts, meanwhile, learned to avoid cameras. Some covered their faces with cloth, others turned away entirely. They knew what would happen. Their images would spread again, their bodies dissected by strangers' eyes. They were already being watched in life, and they refused to be watched in death. But the watchers were persistent. They always returned. There was something magnetic about destruction, something the world could not resist. And so, the cycle continued. Record, share, forget, repeat. Compassion came in waves, followed by silence. Each time the story resurfaced, it was a little less shocking, a little more distant. The addicts' voices, if ever heard, dissolved into static. What remained was the spectacle of their ruin, endlessly replayed until meaning drained away. The world had turned their pain into decoration, their deaths into narrative, and in doing so, it proved that apathy could be as lethal as poison. The world did not save them, but it never stopped looking. It turned their agony into something to watch, to judge, to consume. Their decay became a mirror that no one wanted to recognize, reflecting not just the addict's destruction, but the cruelty of those who could see everything and still do nothing. Some people did not die. Somehow, through luck more than will, they made it through. Their bodies carried the evidence of what they had endured, and their minds kept the memories that never faded. Survival was not victory. It was a kind of unfinished punishment, a long echo of something that should have ended. They told their stories in hospital corridors, in recovery centres, in quiet interviews with trembling hands. The world listened briefly, nodded, and moved on. But their voices, fragile and uneven, were the only record left from a nightmare that most people preferred to forget. The survivors were often unrecognisable, even to themselves. They stared at mirrors with confusion, tracing the lines of scars that ran across their arms, their legs, their faces. The skin had been replaced by rough patches, darkened and sunken, like burned parchment. Their teeth were gone, their eyes dimmed. Breathing was a labour. Some could no longer walk properly. The bones beneath the scars ached when the weather changed. When they smiled, the expression looked forced, as if the body no longer remembered how to move in joy. It is ironic that survival, the thing most people wish for, can feel heavier than death when it comes too late. They spoke of the first moments of withdrawal as something worse than dying. Their bodies shook uncontrollably, sweat ran down their faces in streams, and pain pulsed through every nerve like fire. Some clawed at their skin, begging for another injection, just to stop the agony. The brain screamed for poison, and only silence answered. The survivors said that during those days, they forgot who they were. The world blurred into colours and noise, and only the craving remained clear. When the fever finally broke, what was left of them felt hollow, as if their souls had been stripped bare and left under harsh light. The ones who escaped did so not because they were strong, but because something interrupted their destruction. A police raid, a hospital admission, a friend who refused to leave, a sudden collapse that forced them into care. Some woke up in hospital beds with no memory of how they got there. The doctors told them they had been close to death. They believed it. The body felt foreign, stitched together by accident. For weeks, they moved like shadows, afraid to eat, afraid to sleep, afraid to exist without the drug that had defined them. Time passed, but the scars did not fade. They learned to live in pieces. Each day brought small reminders of what had been lost. The smell of alcohol or gasoline made them sick. The sight of a needle could send them shaking. They avoided mirrors for years. They could no longer enter the neighbourhoods where they once lived. The air itself felt cursed. When people asked about their pasts, they chose silence. Words were too small to hold the things they had seen. If this happened today, it would be like waking up after surviving a disaster everyone else watched online and realizing you were the only one left. Some survivors tried to rebuild. They took jobs, entered therapy, and joined recovery groups. They learned to eat again, to speak without trembling. They attended sessions where they told their stories to new addicts, hoping to scare them away from the same path. But when they looked into the eyes of those listening, they saw the same emptiness they once had. The warnings rarely worked. Addiction does not fear stories. It feeds on disbelief. The survivors knew this, yet they spoke anyway, because silence had almost killed them once. Speaking, even to deaf ears, felt like defiance. In interviews, they often struggled to describe what Krokodil felt like. They said it was not just pain or pleasure, it was erasure. It made the world smaller until only the next injection existed. It replaced hunger, love, sleep, and fear. It made everything simple and terrible. When asked how they survived, most laughed quietly and said they didn't know. Some said God, some said luck, and others said they ran out of poison before it killed them. None claimed strength. Survival, in their stories, was not a choice. It was an accident that needed to be lived with. The psychological wounds lasted longer than the physical ones. Many woke at night with phantom pain, feeling the drug still burning under their skin. Some could not bear human touch. Others cried for no reason at all. They felt both gratitude and guilt for surviving when others did not. They carried the memories of the dead like anchors, dragging them through every attempt at normal life. For them, the past was not over. It lived in their veins, in their scars, in the faint tremor of their hands when the air turned cold. There were moments of beauty, too, small and strange. A woman who had lost both arms to infection learned to paint with her mouth. A man whose legs had been amputated became a counselor, teaching others how to breathe through pain. A former addict raised money for shelters, repeating his story again and again, even when it broke him. They found meaning in fragments, in gestures that rebuilt what the drug had destroyed. Yet even in their triumphs, there was quiet sorrow. They knew that luck, not redemption, had kept them alive. For most, the world did not welcome them back. Neighbours remembered what they had been, not who they were now. Employers hesitated to hire them. Strangers stared at their scars, and children whispered in fear. They were survivors, yes, but also reminders. Their presence made people uncomfortable. It was easier to look away, to pretend recovery erased the past. It did not. The survivors carried their past openly, written across their bodies. Each scar was a sentence that told the truth no one wanted to read. Some of them still live in small apartments, alone, their lives quiet and suspended. They drink tea slowly, smoke cheap cigarettes, and talk to no one. They have learned the value of silence. It protects them from pity, from curiosity, from the cruelty of being turned into a lesson again. They have already been lessons once. Now, they just want to exist. They survived. But survival was not the end. It was a new kind of burden. Their stories remain like open wounds, proof that living through something does not mean escaping it. They are reminders that sometimes the ones who make it out are not the strongest, just the ones who happen to still be breathing when the fire went out. Krokodil not only destroys bodies, it erased faces, names, and voices, reshaping human beings into things unrecognizable, as if the drug wanted to carve the soul away piece by piece. The end was never sudden. It was slow, deliberate, and merciless. Skin decayed, limbs blackened, and eyes emptied of everything once alive. What remained was not death, but distortion. A shadow that looked human from afar but had long lost what made it so. It was not a drug that killed instantly. It was a poison that rewrote the body until the person vanished within it. The destruction came quietly, through habits, through small choices, through hunger and despair. It began in kitchens and basements in forgotten towns where pain was normal and relief was a dream. The victims did not intend to fall this far. They wanted warmth, escape, numbness, but the drug asked for everything and gave nothing in return. It is cruelly funny that something meant to stop pain became the most efficient form of suffering ever invented. Each injection was a promise broken, each high a shorter breath toward the inevitable. At first, they thought they could stop, but stopping required more strength than any of them had left. So they continued. The body decayed, but the craving grew. They could see themselves rotting, smell their own flesh, and still they lifted the syringe. The addiction was no longer chemical. It was spiritual. It replaced faith, love, and reason. It demanded worship, and they obeyed. In that obedience, they lost everything that once made them human. Those who watched from outside saw monsters. They whispered and judged, never realizing they were looking at reflections of neglect, poverty, and hopelessness. Krokodil addicts were not born in isolation. They were created by a system that left entire classes of people to rot long before the drug appeared. The poison only made visible what had already been ignored. If this were happening now, it would still begin in the same way, with loneliness, with despair, with the need to stop feeling for just one night. History does not repeat itself perfectly, but it always rhymes with pain. Governments wrote reports, cities cleared streets, families burned the belongings of their lost children. The world cleaned up the mess, but it could not erase the smell. The stench of rot lingered long after the bodies were gone. Hospitals scrubbed the floors, but the memory stayed. People spoke of it less and less, as if silence could undo the horror. But silence is only another form of burial, and the dead do not rest easily when they have been forgotten. There were no memorials, no names carved into stone. The victims of Krokodil vanished into history like smoke. Their stories lived briefly in tabloids, in documentaries, in whispers exchanged between doctors. Then even that faded. The survivors were left to speak for the rest, their voices trembling with guilt and exhaustion. They said it again and again. Krokodil did not just take lives, it unmade them. It left behind fragments that no one knew how to mourn. In the end, the fear was not death. Death was simple, merciful even. The true terror was forgetting, becoming nothing, leaving no trace, fading until even memory refused to hold on. The addicts feared that most of all, even as they lost the ability to speak. To be forgotten was to die twice, once in body and once in history. And yet, that is what happened. The world moved on. The news turned to other horrors. The images blurred into the past. But beneath the surface of collective memory, something still stirred. A faint echo, a lingering smell, a reminder of what neglect can do when left unchecked. Somewhere in an abandoned building, the paint still peels from the walls where they once lived. Their laughter, faint and broken, seems to hang in the dust. No one goes there now. The neighbours say the air feels heavy, that the silence hums. The ghosts of Krokodil are not loud. They do not haunt through screams. They linger through absence. They exist in the spaces where help never came. For those who study this horror, the story ends without closure. There is no redemption, no final moment of peace. There is only the lesson, ugly, bitter, and necessary. The human body can endure almost anything, but the mind, once starved of hope, will accept even poison as comfort. That is the truth behind Krokodil. It did not just kill, it revealed how fragile survival becomes when a society decides certain people are not worth saving. Krokodil did not only kill its users, it turned them into what they feared most: forgotten, disfigured, erased. The slow rot stripped away the illusion of control until even death became mercy. The last thing they lost was not life, but recognition. And in that loss, the world saw itself reflected in the ugliest way. The story ends here, but the silence it leaves behind should not be mistaken for peace. Somewhere, in memory, the air still smells faintly of smoke and decay. That scent belongs to a generation that tried to forget and failed. Now, close your eyes. Let the noise of the world fade. The story has burned itself out, and only ashes remain. May the night be kind to you. May your dreams stay untouched, and may your sleep be deep and still. Good night.